Miss Jane Marple thought her days of solving murders were over until a letter arrived from beyond the grave. From a dying friend who whispered one word, Nemesis. He sent her to a grand Elizabethan manor on a tour of strangers. But this was no holiday. Within hours, a wealthy tourist lay poisoned, trapped in a house of secrets, surrounded by killers. Can this sharp-eyed old woman expose the truth before the clock tower claims its next victim? The past is bleeding into the present, and Miss Marple is the only one who can stop the killing. But time is running out.
Chapter 1. The Unexpected Summons. The morning sun, a pale gold coin filtered through the delicate lace curtains, warmed the worn surface of Miss Jane Marple's mahogany writing desk. Dust motes danced in its beams, performing a silent, intricate ballet over the scattered remnants of her breakfast, a crust of toast, a smear of marmalade, and the empty cup that had held her Earl Grey. St. Mary Mead lay outside her window, drowsing in the gentle embrace of late spring. Birds chirped with cheerful insistence. A blackbird argued with a thrush over territory near the lilac bush, and the distant, rhythmic thwack of Mr. Peterson's shears trimming his hedge provided a soothing, familiar counterpoint. It was peace. It was routine. It was precisely the sort of morning Miss Marple cherished. A canvas upon which the quiet complexities of village life could be observed and, if necessary, gently unraveled. She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a half-finished piece of knitting, a tiny, intricate sock for a friend's expected grandchild, resting beside her. Her gaze drifted past the desk, beyond the window, to the meticulously tended rose garden bordering her small lawn. Each bloom was a testament to order, to predictable cycles of growth and decay. It was a world she understood, a world where motives, however petty or profound, eventually revealed themselves through careful observation and the application of a lifetime's understanding of human nature. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Much like gardening, she mused, detecting the root of trouble before it chokes everything else. The sharp, decisive rat-a-tat-tat of the brass knocker on her front door shattered the tranquility. Not the hesitant, apologetic tap of a neighbor seeking sugar or gossip, nor the brisk, business-like rap of the postman delivering bills or circulars. This was a sound that carried a weight, an urgency that felt out of place in the sun-drenched calm of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's head tilted, her blue eyes sharpening instantly. She unfolded her hands, placing the knitting carefully aside. The sound was repeated, louder this time, insistent. "Coming, coming," she called out, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the sudden alertness that had stiffened her spine. She rose, her movements economical. The slight stiffness in her joints was a familiar companion she acknowledged but refused to be ruled by. She smoothed the front of her dove-gray cardigan and made her way through the neat, cluttered comfort of her cottage, past the bookshelves groaning under the weight of biographies and botanical guides, past the faded floral armchair by the hearth. She opened the door to find young Albert Higgins, the postman, shifting from foot to foot on her doorstep. His usual cheerful whistle was absent, replaced by a slight frown of concern. His round face, usually flushed with exertion and good humor, looked unusually pale. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice lacking its normal boisterousness. He held out a single, thick envelope. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice lacking its normal boisterousness. He held out a single, thick envelope. Sorry to bother you early, it is. Special delivery. It came registered post, all the way from London. Had the solicitor's mark on it, too. Carruthers and Sons. Made me sign for it twice." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Looks important. And, well, a bit grim, if you don't mind me saying." Miss Marple's gaze fixed on the envelope. It was indeed thick, made of heavy, cream paper with a sharp, clean edge. The handwriting on the front, however, was what seized her attention. It was bold, forceful, yet undeniably shaky, the script of a hand that once had been strong, but was now failing, perhaps through illness or age. It was addressed simply, "Miss Jane Marple, St. Mary Mead, Surrey." No title, no flourish, just the stark facts. The return address confirmed Albert's words, "Carruthers and Sons, Solicitors, Lincoln's Inn Fields, London." "Thank you, Albert," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, though a cold knot had begun to form in the pit of her stomach. She took the envelope, its weight surprising her. "No trouble at all. Just doing your duty, I'm sure." Albert nodded, still looking uneasy. "Right you are, Miss Marple. Just, well, it felt different, that's all. Hope it's nothing bad." He touched the brim of his cap. "Have a good day now." He turned and hurried back down the path, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Casting a final worried glance over his shoulder, Miss Marple closed the door softly, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden silence of her hallway. She didn't move immediately. She stood there, the envelope held lightly between her thumb and forefinger, studying the handwriting. She knew that hand. She knew it intimately, though she hadn't seen it in years. It belonged to Jason Raphael. A wave of complex emotions washed over her. Surprise, a pang of sorrow, and a deep, unsettling curiosity. Jason Raphael, the wealthy, irascible, brilliant businessman she'd encountered during that unsettling business in the Caribbean years ago. A man who had been, by his own admission, a ruthless operator in life, yet who had possessed a buried streak of something akin to justice. They had formed an unlikely, grudging respect, a recognition of shared, if differently expressed, intellect. He had been a force of nature, blunt, demanding, and fiercely intelligent, and, judging by the tremor in the writing, he was likely dead. This letter, delivered by his solicitors, was posthumous.
She walked back to her sitting room, the envelope feeling heavier with each step. She settled into her armchair, the worn fabric familiar and comforting against her back. She placed the envelope on the small table beside her teacup, staring at it as if it might spontaneously combust. The cheerful birdsong outside seemed jarringly inappropriate now. The sunbeam had shifted, illuminating a swirl of dust near the fireplace. With a sigh that was part resignation, part resolve, she picked up the letter opener, a simple silver blade with a mother-of-pearl handle. She slid it under the flap, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside was a single sheet of matching cream paper, folded once. She unfolded it carefully. The same bold, shaky handwriting covered the page. "My dear Miss Marple, I hope this finds you well and as irritatingly perceptive as ever. If you are reading this, it means the inevitable has occurred, and I am no longer burdening this world with my presence. Don't waste sympathy. I had a robust innings and few regrets. However, one matter remains unfinished, a matter of justice, you might say, or perhaps, more accurately, a matter of injustice that festers like a poisoned wound. Something I set in motion but lacked the time, or perhaps the necessary perspective, to see through to its conclusion.
You, my dear, possess that perspective in abundance. Your uncanny knack for seeing the truth hidden beneath the veneer of respectability, your understanding of the dark currents that run beneath the calmest surfaces, these are the tools needed now. Consider this my final commission, a task bequeathed to you not out of sentiment, but out of cold, hard necessity. There is a wrong that needs righting, a secret that needs exposing, and a danger that needs confronting. I have made arrangements. You will receive instructions shortly. They will guide you, but the path will be yours to walk. The key lies in the concept of Nemesis. Not the goddess, perhaps, but the principle, the inescapable consequence of past actions. Seek out Nemesis, Miss Marple, uncover its twisted plot. Justice demands it. Do not fail me, or, more importantly, do not fail those who have suffered too long in silence. Yours, in expectation, and perhaps a touch of grim amusement, Jason Raphael. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The first time her mind raced, connecting dots, recalling Raphael's formidable intellect and his often ruthless methods. The second time, she read it more slowly, savoring the words, dissecting the nuances, feeling the weight of the expectation heaped upon her slender shoulders. A matter of injustice that festers, the phrase echoed in the quiet room. Seek out Nemesis, uncover its twisted plot. It was dramatic, almost theatrical, yet utterly Raphael. He wouldn't have asked lightly. He wouldn't have involved her unless the stakes were genuinely high, the injustice truly profound. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting towards the window again, but she saw neither the roses nor the birds. She saw Jason Raphael, his sharp eyes missing nothing, his voice gruff, but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. She remembered conversations on sun-drenched terraces, discussions about human nature, about the capacity for both great good and profound evil that resided in the most ordinary people. He respected her mind, even if he found her methods quaint, and now, from beyond the grave, he was setting her a challenge. You will receive instructions shortly. What form would they take? A letter? A visitor? A cryptic message hidden in the classifieds? Raphael loved his puzzles, his games. He would have made it intricate, designed to test her from the very outset. The path will be yours to walk. A solitary path, then. No official backing, no police constable to call upon, just her wits, her experience, and her unwavering belief that evil, however cleverly disguised, eventually tripped itself up. A shiver, unrelated to the room's temperature, traced its way down her spine. Danger. He had mentioned danger. Not explicitly, but the implication was clear in the urgency, in the references to a twisted plot and suffering. Jason Raphael wouldn't have minced words about risk. She was an old woman. The thought was not one of fear, but of pragmatic assessment. Her physical limitations were real, yet her mind was as sharp as ever, sharper perhaps, tempered by decades of observing the petty grievances and hidden passions of St. Mary Mead, which were, she had always maintained, merely microcosms of the world's troubles. She rose and walked to the window, her hands clasped behind her back. The peaceful scene outside now seemed like a fragile facade. Somewhere, beyond the familiar lanes and hedgerows of her village, a darkness lurked, an injustice festered, a nemesis waited, and Jason Raphael, in his final, characteristic act, had thrust her into its path. Why her? Truly, it wasn't just her perceptiveness, it was something deeper. Raphael had seen in her a kind of moral compass, unswayed by wealth or status, focused solely on the truth and the restoration of balance,
however messy the process became. He knew she wouldn't flinch from unpleasantness, that she would see it through to the end, however uncomfortable it became. He trusted her, in his own gruff, demanding way, to deliver the justice he felt he owed, perhaps as some form of late-life atonement. The thought brought a strange sense of resolve. It was a burden, yes, but also an affirmation. Her life's work, her quiet observations, her understanding of the human heart were being called upon, not by Scotland Yard, but by a man who operated on a global scale and recognized the unique value she offered.
She turned from the window, her expression thoughtful but determined. The letter lay on the table, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. It was a summons, not from a king or a government, but from the ghost of a complex, difficult man who had placed his final, most crucial confidence in her. There was no question of refusal. Jason Raphael had asked. Justice demanded it, and Miss Jane Marple, knitter of socks, observer of village life, and occasional solver of dark puzzles, felt the familiar, quiet thrill of the chase begin to stir within her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in some time, a sharpening of the senses, a focusing of the mind. The peaceful morning was well and truly shattered, replaced by the anticipation of a journey into the unknown. She picked up the letter once more, folding it carefully and placing it back inside its envelope. She then walked purposefully towards her bedroom. The time for reflection was over. The time for preparation had begun. She had a bag to pack. She didn't know where she was going, what she would face, or what form the instructions would take. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would answer the summons. She would seek out Nemesis, and she would uncover its twisted plot. As she opened the door to her bedroom, the scent of lavender and old wood greeting her, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. Jason Raphael had always enjoyed a challenge. He had just set her the greatest one of her life, and Miss Marple, for all her apparent fragility, was nothing if not thorough. The darkest hour, it seemed, was about to begin, and she would be ready for it.
Chapter 2. Secrets of the Palm Court Hotel. The train journey from St. Mary Mead to London had been a study in contrasts. Miss Marple, nestled in a corner seat with her sensible overnight bag at her feet, watched the familiar patchwork of Surrey fields give way to the sprawling, soot-stained brick of the capital. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was a soothing counterpoint to the whirlwind of thoughts churning in her mind. Jason Raphael's letter, now safely tucked in her handbag, felt like a physical weight, a compass pointing towards an unknown, likely perilous destination. Seek out Nemesis, uncover its twisted plot. The words echoed with each mile marker flashing past. London, when she emerged from the bustle of Victoria Station, was its usual cacophonous self, a symphony of honking taxis, hurrying crowds, and the thick, greasy scent of exhaust fumes and fried food. Miss Marple, a small island of calm gray tweed and white hair, navigated the throng with practiced ease, her days taking in everything. The sharp-suited businessmen striding with purpose, the wide-eyed tourists consulting maps, the weary shopkeepers adjusting displays. It was a world away from St. Mary Mead's measured pace, yet the underlying currents of human ambition, anxiety, and hidden motives were fundamentally the same, just louder. Her instructions, delivered by a terse, impersonal telegram from Carruthers & Sons the previous day, were succinct. Proceed Palm Court Hotel, South Kensington. Booking confirmed under Marple. Await further contact. No explanation, no context, just the bare bones of a directive. Classic Raphael.
He would have relished the mystery, the sense of being a pawn moved across a board only he could fully see. The Palm Court Hotel stood on a quiet tree-lined square, an imposing edifice of cream stucco and wrought iron balconies that spoke of a more gracious, if perhaps less honest, era. It exuded an air of discreet wealth and faded grandeur. A liveried doorman, impeccably polished and radiating an aura of silent judgment, swung open the heavy glass door as she approached. The lobby was a hushed cathedral of polished marble, towering potted palms, and the soft, expensive murmur of hushed conversations. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, diffused light over plush velvet armchairs and thick carpets that swallowed sound. It was the kind of place where secrets felt comfortably at home, wrapped in luxury and anonymity. Miss Marple. The voice belonged to a woman behind the imposing reception desk, young, impeccably groomed, with a smile so polished it seemed permanently fixed. Her name tag read Eleanor. "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the hushed space. "Welcome to the Palm Court, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her fingers flying over a large leather-bound register. "We have you confirmed for 3 nights initially. Your room is ready, a superior single overlooking the square, very quiet. And," she added, lowering her voice slightly, though it was still perfectly audible, "your tour arrangements have been finalized. The Historic Homes of England coach departs tomorrow morning, promptly at 9. Full itinerary and documentation are in your room." Miss Marple felt a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. A coach tour? It seemed mundane, almost disappointingly so for a mission involving Nemesis and twisted plots. Yet Raphael's methods were rarely straightforward. He would embed his puzzle within the ordinary, making it harder to spot. The tour was the vehicle, the framework. The real journey would be happening beneath the surface. "Thank you, Eleanor," Miss Marple said smoothly. "That sounds most efficient. I trust the tour company is reputable." "Oh, absolutely, Miss Marple," Eleanor assured her, her smile unwavering. "Stately Discoveries Limited. They're one of the best, very exclusive, small groups. Your fellow guests are already arriving. Many are dining in this evening, I believe. The Palm Room serves until 10. She handed over a key on a heavy brass fob. "Room 417. The lift is just to your left." Room 417 was indeed quiet, tastefully decorated in shades of sage green and cream, with a large window offering a view of the tranquil square below. A large envelope lay on the polished mahogany desk, embossed with the stately Discoveries logo. Inside was a detailed itinerary, a name badge on a lanyard, and a small booklet about the first destination, Whodunit. The name sent a faint, unfamiliar prickle down Miss Marple's spine. She scanned the booklet's description. Whodunit, a magnificent Elizabethan manor, home to the Verity family for over 4 centuries, renowned for its intricate plasterwork, rare tapestries, and the tragic history surrounding the untimely death of Lady Eleanor Verity in 1952. Tragic history, another Raphael hallmark. After unpacking her few belongings with meticulous care, hanging her dresses, arranging her toiletries, placing her knitting bag neatly on the bedside table, Miss Marple decided to venture down to the Palm Room. Raphael had instructed her to observe, to gather threads. The tour group was the first tapestry she needed to examine. The Palm Room was even more opulent than the lobby. Low lighting from crystal wall sconces reflected off silverware and crystal glasses. Small, intimate tables were occupied by well-dressed couples and singles, their conversations low murmurs.
A pianist in the corner played soft, unobtrusive jazz. Miss Marple requested a small table for one near the edge, a position that offered a clear view of the room while allowing her to remain relatively unobserved. She ordered a simple pot of Earl Grey and a scone, and settled in, her gaze sweeping the room with practiced detachment. It didn't take long to spot her fellow travelers. They clustered together, a small island of louder chatter amidst the hotel's general hush. There were 6 of them, excluding herself. At the center of the group sat a couple that practically radiated nervous wealth. The man, perhaps in his late 60s, had a florid face, a carefully arranged comb-over, and wore an expensively tailored suit that strained slightly across his middle. He fiddled constantly with his heavy gold signet ring. His wife, a decade younger, was blonde, impeccably coiffed, and draped in pearls that looked real. Her smile was tight, her eyes constantly darting around the room, lingering on exits and other patrons. She kept touching the strand of pearls at her throat, a gesture that seemed less about adornment and more about reassurance. The Sanders, Miss Marple deduced, recalling the itinerary's guest list. Money, but not old money. And fear, palpable fear, thinly disguised by brittle confidence. Beside them, holding court in a quieter fashion, was a man who commanded attention despite his stillness. He was tall, gaunt, with sharp features and eyes the color of faded denim that missed nothing. His dark suit was impeccably cut, but worn, the cuffs slightly frayed. He had the air of a scholar, or perhaps a retired military man who had seen too much. He spoke little, but when he did, the others leaned in. This was Professor Alistair Wanstead, the itinerary noted, a historian specializing in Elizabethan architecture. Yet there was a watchfulness about him, a tension in the set of his shoulders that spoke of something beyond academic interest. Contrasting sharply with the Sanders' anxiety and the professor's intensity was the young couple, Michael and Joanna. He was dark-haired, handsome in a boyish way, with an open, engaging smile and an easy charm that seemed genuine. He was telling an animated story, gesturing with his hands, making the others laugh. Joanna, beside him, was striking, tall with a cascade of auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that observed the group with a cool, assessing gaze. She laughed at Michael's jokes, but her laughter didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a reserve there, a watchfulness that mirrored Miss Marple's own. They were clearly in love, but also something else. Partners in more than romance? Miss Marple wondered. The final 2 members of the group were less immediately striking. Mrs. Elspeth Gable was a small bird-like woman in her late 50s, dressed in sensible brown tweed. She had a kind, rather anxious face and kept twisting a plain handkerchief in her lap.
She listened intently to everyone, nodding frequently, but contributed little. The itinerary listed her as a retired governess. Opposite her sat Mr. Cedric Thorne, a man of indeterminate age, perhaps late 50s or early 60s. He was solidly built, with a ruddy complexion and thinning gray hair. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket and had the slightly distracted air of someone perpetually lost in thought. He was listed as a retired solicitor.
He seemed preoccupied, staring into his untouched glass of sherry, only occasionally looking up when addressed directly. Miss Marple observed the dynamics. Michael tried to draw the quieter members out, particularly Mrs. Gable, with gentle questions. Joanna watched Michael with fondness, but her attention kept flickering towards the Sanders and Professor Wanstead. Mr. Sanders spoke loudly, trying to dominate the conversation, often interrupted by his wife's nervous interjections. Professor Wanstead remained largely silent, his gaze occasionally sweeping the room, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the entrance, the windows, the other diners. Mr. Thorne remained lost in his own world, while Mrs. Gable seemed to shrink slightly whenever Mr. Sanders raised his voice. It was a microcosm of human interaction, but beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed the subtle undercurrents Raphael had hinted at. The Sanderses' fear wasn't just social anxiety. It felt deeper, more specific. Professor Wanstead's watchfulness wasn't mere curiosity. It felt like surveillance. Michael and Joanna's charm felt like a carefully constructed facade. Mrs. Gable's anxiety seemed to stem from more than just shyness. Mr. Thorne's distraction felt like a shield. And Stonegates. The name hung unspoken in the air, a shared point of reference that no one yet dared to voice. After finishing her tea, Miss Marple decided a gentle reconnaissance was in order. She rose and wandered towards the hotel's small library, a cozy room lined with bookshelves and boasting a large fireplace, currently unlit. As she browsed a shelf of local histories, she heard voices in the adjoining corridor, low, urgent, and unmistakably belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Sanders. "Absolutely sure it's safe, Harold," Mrs. Sanders hissed, her voice trembling. "Perhaps we should just leave, go home. This feels wrong." "Nonsense, Beatrice," Mr. Sanders snapped, though his own voice lacked conviction. "We've paid. We're committed. Running away now would look suspicious. We just need to keep our heads down. Stick to the plan. It's just a tour, for heaven's sake. See the sights, nod politely, and go home. No one knows anything." "But he knows, Harold. The professor. He looked at me. He knows something. And that young couple, they're too sharp. And the old lady," her voice dropped even lower, "the one knitting in the corner. She watches everything, like a hawk." Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her back to the doorway, her heart beating a little faster. The old lady knitting. So, she'd been noticed. And perceived as a threat, or merely an observer. The Sanders were clearly terrified of someone on this tour knowing something connected to the past, to Stonegates. And the professor was a specific focus of their fear. "Don't be ridiculous, Beatrice," Mr. Sanders blustered, but the effect was ruined by the tremor in his voice. "Wanstead's just a stuffy academic, and the others, they're tourists. We're safe as long as we don't talk. Remember, not a word about then, not to anyone." Their voices faded as they moved away down the corridor. Miss Marple remained slowly extracted a book on English manor houses, her mind racing. Then, what had happened then? The tragic death of Eleanor Verity? And why were the Sanders so terrified of it being discussed? What was their connection? And why involve Professor Wanstead, the historian? Perhaps his expertise wasn't just architectural. She returned to her room, the book a prop. The atmosphere in the Palm Court, initially one of luxurious calm, now felt charged, thick with unspoken secrets and palpable fear. Raphael hadn't just sent her on a tour, he'd placed her in a pressure cooker. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, mirroring Miss Marple's sense of foreboding. Breakfast in the hotel's dining room was a subdued affair. The tour group gathered, their initial awkwardness now overlaid with a brittle tension. Mr. Sanders ate with noisy determination, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Sanders picked at her food, her gaze darting nervously. Professor Wanstead scrutinized the morning paper with unnerving intensity. Michael and Joanna made polite conversation about the weather, their charm slightly strained. Mrs. Gable sipped tea, looking pale. Mr. Thorne stared into his scrambled eggs as if they held the secrets of the universe. At precisely 9 o'clock, a uniformed tour guide, a brisk, efficient young woman named Brenda, gathered them in the lobby. "Welcome, everyone, to Stately Discoveries. I'm Brenda, and I'll be your guide for our exploration of England's hidden gems. Our first destination is Stonegates Manor, a real treat, steeped in history. The coach is waiting outside. Let's make a start." As they filed out towards the waiting luxury coach, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Gable. "A fascinating start to our adventure, isn't it?" Miss Marple remarked gently. Mrs. Gable jumped slightly, then offered a weak smile. "Oh, yes, quite. Though, I must admit, I haven't been back to that part of the country in a very long time. Brings back memories. Some not less pleasant than others." She twisted her handkerchief again. "Memories can be such tricky things," Miss Marple said sympathetically, "especially attached to old houses. They seem to soak them up." Nodded vigorously. Exactly like that. Soak them right up. Sometimes you wish they could just be washed clean." She fell silent, her gaze fixed on the wet pavement. On the coach, Miss Marple chose a seat midway back, giving her a view of most of the other passengers. Mr. and Mrs. Sanders sat near the front, whispering fiercely. Professor Wanstead sat alone by a window, staring out at the drizzly London streets, his profile stern and preoccupied. Michael and Joanna sat together near the middle, Michael pointing out landmarks with cheerful enthusiasm. Mrs. Gable sat alone near Miss Marple, looking out the opposite window. Mr. Thorne was already asleep, his head lolling against the window. As the coach navigated the city streets, Brenda began her commentary, her voice bright and amplified through the coach's PA system. "And as we leave London behind, we're heading towards the home countries, an area rich in heritage. Our first stop, Stonegates Manor, is a prime example of Elizabethan grandeur, built in the late 1590s by Sir Thomas Verity." Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her attention focused on the group. Brenda's cheerful description of the manor's architectural features, the intricate strapwork plasterwork, the great hall, the mullioned windows, seemed to hang in the air. Then Brenda mentioned the family. "And of course the manor has been home to the Verity family ever since. The current residents are Lady Elizabeth Verity, the widow of the late Sir Richard Verity, and her son, the current heir, Marcus Verity. The family has, of course, seen its share of triumphs and tragedies over the centuries, most notably the sad passing of Sir Richard's sister, Lady Eleanor Verity, back in 1952. The name Eleanor Verity seemed to land like a stone in a still pond. Miss Marple saw Mr. Sanders visibly flinch. Mrs. Sanders gasped softly, her hand flying to her pearls. Professor Wanstead, who had been staring blankly out the window, turned his head sharply, his faded denim eyes fixing on Brenda with an intensity that was almost alarming. His knuckles, resting on his knee, whitened. Mrs. Gable let out a tiny choked sob and quickly buried her face in her handkerchief. Even Michael's cheerful expression faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable, before he masked it with a bright smile directed at Joanna. Joanna's green eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze sweeping the reactions of the others with cool assessment. Only Mr. Thorne remained oblivious, snoring softly. Brenda, oblivious to the storm she inadvertently stirred, continued brightly, though the official cause was recorded as an unfortunate accident, a fall down the grand staircase. The event has certainly added a layer of poignant history to the house. Some say her spirit still walks the galleries."
Professor Wanstead abruptly leaned forward and jabbed the call button above his head with a sharp, stabbing motion. The electronic ding sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the coach. Brenda paused her commentary, looking slightly startled. "Yes, Professor Wanstead? Is everything all right?" Brenda asked, her professional smile slipping a fraction. Wanstead's voice, when he spoke, was low, clipped, and carried an edge of steel that cut through the coach's hush. Every word was carefully measured, yet imbued with a simmering tension that made the hairs on Miss Marple's neck prickle. "Brenda," he began, his gaze not leaving the back of the driver's head, "while I appreciate the historical context, I must request we dispense with the sensationalism.
particularly regarding the Verity family's private tragedies. Speculation about spirits and rehashing unfortunate accidents serves no educational purpose and is, frankly, disrespectful to the family and the deceased. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Stonegates is an architectural treasure. Let us focus on its significance as such. The rest is irrelevant. The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Sanders looked like he might be sick. Mrs. Gable was trembling. Michael looked uncomfortable. Joanna watched Wanstead with an expression of cold, analytical interest. Brenda flushed slightly. "Oh, yes, of course, Professor. My apologies. Quite right. We'll focus on the architecture. Thank you for the correction." She floundered for a moment, then launched into a detailed description of Elizabethan brickwork techniques, her voice noticeably less confident. Miss Marple leaned back in her seat, her knitting bag untouched in her lap. The drizzle streaked the coach windows, blurring the passing countryside into grey smudges. The cheerful facade of the Palm Court Hotel felt a world away. Here, in the confines of the coach, the air crackled with unspoken grief, shared fear, and a palpable sense of danger. Professor Wanstead's reaction hadn't been mere academic pedantry. It had been a warning, a sharp, public, and deeply revealing warning. He hadn't just objected to sensationalism. He had tried to shut down any mention of Eleanor Verity's death entirely. The rest is irrelevant. But it was anything but irrelevant. It was the epicenter. The Sanderses' terror, Mrs. Gable's distress, the sudden tension in Michael and Joanna, it all stemmed from that name, that event. And Wanstead, the historian, was desperate to keep it buried. Raphael's words echoed in her mind. Seek out Nemesis, uncover its twisted plot. She had found the stage. She had met the players, each burdened by their connection to a decades-old tragedy. And she had just witnessed the first sharp move in a game where the stakes were life and death. The coach rumbled on toward Stonegate, and Miss Marple knew with chilling certainty that the darkest hour was far closer than the manor's looming gates. The twisted plot was already unfolding, and its architect, Nemesis, was sitting just a few seats ahead, radiating cold fury and desperate control. The journey had truly begun.
Chapter 3. Blood on the Ancient Stones. The coach crunched to a halt on the gravelled forecourt of Stonygates Manor. The drizzle had finally ceased, leaving the air washed clean and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else, something faintly melancholic, like old paper and dried lavender. Miss Marple stepped down, her sensible shoes making no sound on the wet gravel, and looked up. Stonygates rose before them like a silent, brooding sentinel. It was undeniably magnificent, a sprawling Elizabethan pile of mellow brick and soaring mullioned windows, crowned with intricate chimneys that pierced the grey sky. But its grandeur felt oppressive, watchful. Vast expanses of leaded glass reflected the scudding clouds like blank, staring eyes. Ivy, dark and lush, clung to the lower walls, seeming to strangle the stone rather than adorn it. The grand entrance, a heavy oak door studded with iron beneath a carved stone canopy, looked less welcoming and more like the maw of a great sleeping beast. Brenda, the tour guide, clapped her hands briskly, her voice artificially bright in the hushed atmosphere. "And here we are, Stonygates Manor. Please gather round for a moment before we go inside. Photography is permitted in most areas, but please respect any private signs. The family wing is strictly off-limits. We'll be met by a guide from the house who will take us through the public rooms. Any questions?" There were none. The group stood silently, their faces upturned towards the manor. Mr. Sanders wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, despite the cool air, his florid face seeming paler than usual. Mrs. Sanders clutched his arm, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the upper windows as if expecting a ghostly face to appear. Professor Wanstead stood slightly apart, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the facade with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging more than just architectural details. Michael and Joanna exchanged a glance. Michael's usual cheer was replaced by a thoughtful frown, while Joanna's green eyes were narrowed, assessing the building's imposing facade with cool detachment. Mrs. Gable twisted her handkerchief into a tight knot, her small frame seeming to shrink further into her sensible tweed coat. Only Mr. Thorne seemed oblivious, peering myopically at a flock of rooks circling the highest tower. The heavy oak door swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges. A man stood framed in the doorway, tall, thin, and dressed in a somber black suit that seemed to absorb the light. He had sharp, angular features, pale skin stretched taut over high cheekbones, and eyes the color of cold river water that surveyed the group with an air of detached disdain. This was clearly not the warm, welcoming housekeeper of country house clichés. "Welcome to Stonygates," he said, his voice as dry and devoid of warmth as fallen leaves. "I am Mr. Harding, the Verity family's steward. Lady Elizabeth Verity regrets she is unable to greet you personally due to a prior engagement. She trusts you will find your visit informative." The slight pause before informative spoke volumes. "Please follow me. We begin in the Great Hall." He turned and led them into a cavernous space that lived up to its name. A vaulted ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive oak beams blackened with age. A colossal stone fireplace, large enough to roast an ox, dominated one end, though it was cold and empty. Walls were hung with faded, threadbare tapestries depicting hunts and battles, their colors muted into somber browns and greens. Portraits of severe-looking men and women in Elizabethan and Jacobean garb glowered down from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. The air was cold, smelling of dust, stone, and the faint, sweet decay of ancient wood. Mr. Harding's commentary was as dry as his appearance. He pointed out the hammer-beam roof, the minstrel's gallery, the supposed blood stain on the flagstones that couldn't be removed, a relic of some long-forgotten quarrel. His recitation was factual, devoid of any hint of the human drama that surely unfolded within these walls. It felt deliberately sterile, a carefully constructed narrative, ignoring the elephant in the room, or rather, the ghost in the gallery. As they moved from the great hall into a series of smaller, wood-paneled rooms, the long gallery lined with more stern portraits, the blue drawing room with its delicate silk hangings, Miss Marple observed the group's reactions with keen interest. Mr. Sanders became increasingly agitated, jumping at sudden noises, the settling of the old house, the creak of floorboards, constantly adjusting his tie, his eyes darting towards windows and doors. Mrs. Sanders hovered near him, her fear palpable. Professor Wanstead, however, seemed to relax slightly. He moved with a proprietary air, occasionally murmuring corrections to Mr. Harding's descriptions about the provenance of a chair or the date of a plaster ceiling medallion. Mr. Harding would stiffen slightly, but offer no rebuttal. It was clear Wanstead knew Stonygates intimately, far beyond the level of a casual historian. Michael and Joanna maintained polite facade, but Miss Marple noted Michael's subtle attempts to draw Mrs. Gable into conversation, asking gentle questions about the furniture or the portraits, trying to offer a sliver of normalcy.
Mrs. Gable responded with monosyllables, her gaze constantly flickering towards the Sanders. Mr. Thorne trailed behind, occasionally stopping to peer closely at a carving or a piece of porcelain, lost in his own world. The tour progressed through the staterooms, each one more imposing and less welcoming than the last. Finally, Mr. Harding led them down a long, dimly lit corridor lined with bookshelves, overflowing with leather-bound volumes. "And here," he announced, gesturing towards a heavy oak door at the far end, "is the library, one of the finest collections of Elizabethan literature and historical manuscripts in the country. You may browse for 15 minutes. Please do not touch the rare volumes on the central display cases. Refreshments will be served in the adjoining anteroom afterwards." The library was a scholar's dream and a claustrophobe's nightmare. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with thousands of volumes created narrow, shadowed aisles. The air was thick with old paper, leather polish, and dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through one single leaded window. A large, ornate partner's desk dominated the center of the room, its surface polished to a deep shine. Glass-fronted cabinets displayed priceless, illuminated manuscripts under carefully controlled lighting. As the group dispersed, Mr. Sanders made a beeline for the desk. He seemed drawn to it, perhaps seeking a moment of solitude, a solid object to anchor himself in the oppressive atmosphere. He leaned heavily against its edge, running a trembling hand over the polished wood. Mrs. Sanders hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Professor Wanstead immediately gravitated to a glass case containing a collection of early maps. He stood before it, his back to the room, utterly absorbed. Michael and Joanna wandered down one of the aisles, their voices low murmurs lost in the cavernous space. Mrs. Gable sank into a deep leather armchair near the door, pulling her handkerchief out again. Mr. Thorne was already examining a row of calf-bound volumes, his nose inches from the spines. Miss Marple moved slowly along a shelf of regional histories, her gaze seemingly on the book titles, but her attention was focused on the room, on the people, on the atmosphere. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of pages, the soft tread of feet on the thick carpet, and the distant, mournful cry of a rook outside.
She noticed Mr. Sanders reach into his inside jacket pocket and pull out a small silver flask. With a furtive glance around the room, his eyes skipping over Wanstead's back, lingering for a fraction of a second on the aisle where Michael and Joanna had disappeared, then skinning past Mrs. Gable and Mr. Thorne, he unscrewed the cap. He took a quick, sharp swallow, then another, his Adam's apple bobbing. He replaced the cap and slipped the flask back into his pocket, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked even paler now, if that were possible, and a fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He leaned more heavily against the desk, his breathing becoming slightly labored. Miss Marple frowned. The gesture spoke of deep-seated anxiety, bordering on panic. What was he so afraid of? The house itself? The memories it held? Or someone in this room? Her gaze drifted towards the partner's desk. On its polished surface, near where Sanders had been leaning, sat a crystal glass tumbler. It was nearly empty, containing only a faint residue of a dark amber liquid at the bottom. Water? Brandy? Something else. It hadn't been there when they first entered, she was almost certain. Someone must have placed it there recently. Sanders? Or someone else? She took a step closer to the desk, ostensibly to examine a globe near it. As she did, a faint, almost imperceptible scent reached her nostrils,
cutting through the pervasive smell of old books and dust. It was sharp, acrid, unnervingly out of place. Bitter almonds. The scent was fleeting, gone almost as soon as she registered it, but it sent a jolt of pure ice-cold alarm through her. Cyanide. The scent of cyanide was bitter almonds. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with terrifying speed. Sanders's sudden illness, the furtive drink from the flask, the nearly empty glass on the desk, the bitter almond scent. Had he poisoned himself? Or had someone poisoned him? Before she could act, before she could even fully process the horrifying thought, a low moan escaped Mr. Sanders' lips. It was a sound of pure agony, startlingly loud in the library silence. He clutched his chest with both hands, his eyes wide with terror and pain. His legs buckled. "Harold!" Mrs. Sanders screamed, her voice high and piercing, shattering the quiet. She lunged toward him. Mr. Sanders collapsed onto the thick carpet beside the desk, his body convulsing violently. His face turned a horrifying shade of purple, his eyes bulging. Foamy saliva bubbled at his lips. He made a terrible guttural choking sound. Panic erupted. Mrs. Gable screamed and shrank back into her chair, covering her face. Michael and Joanna came running out of the aisle, their faces masks of shock. Mr. Thorne looked up, bewildered, as if dragged from a dream. Professor Wanstead spun around from the maps, his cold eyes widening slightly, his hand instinctively flying to his chest, as if to steady his own heart. Miss Harding appeared in the doorway, his usual impassivity shattered. "Good God! What's this? What's happening?" He rushed forward, barking orders. "Someone call for a doctor! The house phone! In the anteroom! Now! Joanna, was it? Go! Michael, assist me! Clear the area! Give him air!" But it was too late. The violent convulsions subsided as quickly as they had begun. Mr. Sanders lay utterly still, his vacant eyes staring sightlessly at the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling. The awful purple hue began to fade, leaving his skin waxy and pale. The only sound was Mrs. Sanders' hysterical sobbing and the frantic pounding of feet as Joanna ran to find the phone. Miss Marple stood frozen for a moment, the chilling scent of bitter almonds still lingering in her memory. It wasn't a heart attack, not a natural one. She knew it with the certainty that came from a lifetime of observing the darker side of human nature. This was murder, committed here, in this hushed room filled with the weight of centuries, under the watchful eyes of stern ancestors. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. The local police arrived, led by a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense Detective Inspector Davies. He was a man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed grey moustache and eyes that missed nothing, radiating an aura of weary competence. He secured the library, turning it into an impromptu crime scene. The tour group was herded into the anteroom, a smaller, less intimidating space with comfortable chairs and a tea service laid out that now looked grotesquely incongruous. Mrs. Sanders was sedated and taken to lie down in a small room upstairs under the care of a concerned housemaid. Inspector Davies interviewed each member of the tour group individually in a small, cramped study off the main corridor. Miss Marple watched as they were called, one by one. The tearful Mrs. Gable, the bewildered Mr. Thorne, the grim-faced Professor Wanstead, the pale but composed Michael, the coolly analytical Joanna. Each emerged looking shaken, avoiding each other's eyes. Finally, it was Miss Marple's turn. She entered the study, closing the door softly behind her. Inspector Davies sat behind a small, cluttered desk, a notebook open before him.
He gestured to a chair opposite. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice brisk but not unkind. "Thank you for your patience. I understand this is a dreadful shock for everyone. Just a few questions, if you don't mind. Routine procedure." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair and placing her knitting bag primly on her lap. "A terrible business, truly terrible." "Indeed," Davis agreed, making a note. "You were in the library when Mr. Sanders collapsed." "Yes, I was browsing the history section, near the Globe." "Did you notice anything unusual, anything at all before he, became ill?" Miss Marple met his gaze directly. "I did, Inspector. Several things, though I didn't realize their significance until it was too late." Davis leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharpening. "Go on, please." "Firstly, Mr. Sanders seemed extremely agitated, even more so than he had earlier. He was sweating profusely despite the coolness of the house. He leaned heavily against the partner's desk. I saw him take a drink from a small silver flask he kept in his jacket pocket. He took 2 rather large swallows, very furtively." Davis made a note. "A flask. We'll need to locate that. Anything else?" "Yes. On the desk, near where he was leaning, there was a crystal glass tumbler. It was nearly empty, containing only a small amount of dark amber liquid at the bottom. I don't recall seeing it when we first entered the library." Davis nodded slowly. "A glass. Forensics will check it. And—" Miss Marple paused, choosing her words with care. "And, Inspector, just before Mr. Sanders collapsed, I caught a very faint but quite distinct scent in the air near the desk. It was sharp, acrid, unnervingly out of place. Bitter almonds. The scent was fleeting, gone almost as soon as she registered it, but it sent a jolt of pure ice-cold alarm through her. Cyanide. The scent of cyanide was bitter almonds. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with terrifying speed. Sanders's sudden illness, the furtive drink from the flask, the nearly empty glass on the desk, the bitter almond scent. Had he poisoned himself? Or had someone poisoned him?
"Charged is certainly one word for it," Davies said heavily. He stood up. "That will be all for now, Miss Marple. I may need to speak with you again later. Please remain available." "Of course, Inspector. I understand." As Miss Marple walked back towards the anteroom, the weight of what she had witnessed settled upon her. The library, with its silent watching books and the ghost of bitter almonds, felt like a tomb. Harold Sanders was dead, murdered, and she was the only one besides the inspector who seemed to grasp the horrifying truth of how. She found the remaining tour group huddled together in the anteroom, speaking in hushed, fearful whispers. Mrs. Gable was weeping quietly. Mr. Thorne stared into space, looking utterly lost. Michael had his arm around Joanna, who looked pale but composed, her expression thoughtful. Professor Wanstead stood by the window, looking out at the gray gardens, his profile stern and unreadable. The silence that fell when Miss Marple entered was thick with unspoken terror. They looked at her, their eyes filled with questions and dread. They knew. They might not know the how, not yet, but they knew the why was rooted in the past, in the secrets of Stonygates, in the name Eleanor Verity. Harold Sanders hadn't just died, he had been silenced, permanently. Miss Marple took a seat by the cold fireplace. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The air crackled with the shared, terrible knowledge. The game Jason Raphael had sent her to play had just claimed its first victim,
and as she looked at the frightened faces around her, the professor's rigid back, Joanna's calculating eyes, Michael's dawning horror, Mrs. Gable's despair, Mr. Thorne's confusion, she knew with chilling certainty that Harold Sanders was just the beginning. Nemesis had made its opening move, and the twisted plot was far from over. The blood on the ancient stones was a warning, written in the most final of terms. The darkest hour had well and truly arrived.
Chapter 4. Web of Deceit. The aftermath of Harold Sanders' death clung to Stonygate's manor like a shroud. The grand Elizabethan rooms, designed to impress and intimidate, now felt suffocating, their ancient stones absorbing the shock and fear radiating from the huddled tour group in the anteroom. The delicate scent of tea and dust was overlaid with the acrid tang of panic and the faint, lingering memory of bitter almonds that haunted Miss Marple's senses. Inspector Davies had efficiently cordoned off the library, transforming it into a sterile zone of forensic activity, but the stain of violence had already seeped into the very fabric of the house. Miss Marple sat rigidly in a high-backed wing chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knitting bag untouched beside her. She observed the remaining members of the tour group with the focused attention of a naturalist studying specimens under a microscope. Each was reacting differently to the trauma, their carefully constructed facades cracking under the pressure. Mrs. Gable, the retired governess, had dissolved into quiet, uncontrollable weeping. She sat hunched on a settee, clutching a sodden handkerchief, her small frame trembling. Her distress seemed deeper than mere shock at witnessing a sudden death. It carried the weight of a specific, personal grief. Mr. Thorne, the retired solicitor, appeared utterly bewildered. He paced slowly near the window, running a hand through his thinning gray hair, muttering fragments of legal phrases under his breath. Duty of care, unforeseeable circumstances, gross negligence, as if trying to fit the horrific reality into a familiar, logical framework that no longer applied. Professor Wanstead had retreated into an icy shell of composure. He stood near the cold fireplace, his back ramrod straight, his faded denim eyes fixed on the dying embers with unnerving stillness. His usual watchfulness was now layered with a palpable tension, a coiled readiness that suggested he was bracing for an attack, either verbal or otherwise. Michael and Joanna sat together on another settee, a picture of young solidarity, yet the strain was evident. Michael's face was pale, his boyish charm replaced by a haunted expression. Joanna, while outwardly calm, held herself rigidly, her green eyes constantly scanning the room, missing nothing, assessing everyone with a chilling detachment that belied her youth. The silence was broken only by Mrs. Gable's muffled sobs and the distant, muffled voices of the police team in the corridor. The weight of unspoken secrets pressed down, thicker than the dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through the tall windows. Everyone knew Harold Sanders hadn't simply died. He had been killed, and the reason lay buried in the past of this very house. The door opened, and Inspector Davies entered, followed by a younger, earnest-looking sergeant who carried a clipboard. Davies' expression was grim, his mustache seeming more bristly than usual. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on each face before settling on the group as a whole. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice low and authoritative, cutting through the oppressive quiet, "I appreciate this is an extremely distressing time. We are treating Mr. Sanders' death as suspicious.
A post-mortem will be conducted, and until we have the results and complete our initial inquiries, I must ask for your full cooperation. None of you are under arrest, but you are all material witnesses. You will need to remain available at the Palm Court Hotel for the next few days. Travel arrangements are being made accordingly. A collective shudder went through the room. Mr. Thorne stopped pacing, looking genuinely alarmed. Mrs. Gable let out a fresh sob. Professor Wanstead's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I need to speak with each of you again, more formally, about your movements and observations this morning. But first, I have some preliminary questions for the group. He looked directly at Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable, you seemed particularly distressed. Did you know Mr. Sanders well? Mrs. Gable flinched, twisting her handkerchief. Know him? No, not well. Only from the tour. But, oh, Inspector, her voice cracked. It brought it all back. The fear, the secrets. She whispered the last word, then clamped her hand over her mouth as if afraid she'd said too much. Brought what back, Mrs. Gable? Davies pressed, gently but firmly. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror. Stonygates, Eleanor, the lies. She whispered the last word. Davies' gaze sharpened. He turned to Professor Wanstead. Professor Wanstead, you are an expert on Elizabethan architecture, yet you seem to have a personal reaction when Miss Brenda mentioned Lady Eleanor Verity earlier on the coach. And you were quite insistent that discussion of her death was irrelevant. Why is that? Wanstead drew himself up, his expression icy. Inspector, my objection was purely professional. Sensationalism about historical tragedies, especially those involving private families still in residence, is distasteful and unbecoming of a serious tour. My interest in Stonygates is architectural and historical, not morbid. Yet you corrected Mr. Harding several times on details, suggesting an intimate knowledge beyond mere scholarship. I have studied the manor extensively. I have published papers on its plasterwork. That does not imply personal involvement in family tragedies from half a century ago. Davies let it hang for a moment, then turned to Michael and Joanna. Mr. and Mrs. Farrell, you seemed composed under the circumstances. What is your connection to Stonygates or to the Verity family?
Michael spoke quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. None whatsoever, Inspector. We're just tourists, history buffs. Joanna's always wanted to see Elizabethan manners. It's our anniversary trip. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Joanna added smoothly, her voice calm and clear, We were as shocked as everyone else. A terrible tragedy. We'll cooperate fully, of course. Her gaze met Davies without flinching, cool and unreadable. Finally, Davies looked at Mr. Thorne. Mr. Thorne, you're a retired solicitor. Did you ever handle any legal work for the Verity family, or perhaps know Mr. Sanders professionally? Thorne blinked as if surfacing from deep thought. Verity family? Good heavens, no. My practice was entirely in London. Commercial law, mostly. Sanders? Harold Sanders. The name rings a faint bell. Barrister, wasn't he? Criminal law? We might have crossed paths at the Old Bailey once or twice, decades ago, but nothing significant. A dreadful business. Dreadful. He shook his head, looking genuinely distressed, but also profoundly confused. Davies thanked them curtly. The sergeant will take individual statements shortly. Please remain here. He turned and left, the sergeant following him out. The silence that descended was even heavier than before. The inspector's questions had acted like probes, exposing raw nerves and hinting at hidden connections. Mrs. Gable's outburst about secrets and lies hung in the air. Wanstead's defensiveness was palpable. Michael and Joanna's story felt thin, rehearsed.
Thorne's vagueness was suspicious. Miss Marple's mind worked furiously, connecting the fragments. Sanders wasn't just a nervous tourist. He was a retired barrister. Wanstead knew the house too well. Mrs. Gable's terror was specific, and Joanna, her composure was almost unhuman. Later that afternoon, after giving her own detailed statement to the sergeant, carefully mentioning the flask and the glass, but strategically omitting the bitter almond scent for now, wanting to gauge the official reaction, Miss Marple sought out the Palm Court Hotel's small, discreet business center. She needed information. The local archives in the nearest market town were her next logical step. The archives were housed in a rather drab red brick building behind the town hall. The air inside was cool, dry, and smelled of aging paper and binding glue. Miss Marple, armed with her spectacles and a notebook, approached the reference desk, presided over by a woman with kind eyes and hair scraped back into a severe bun. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple began. "I'm hoping to look into some local history, specifically the Verity family of Stonygates Manor, and an incident that occurred there in 1952, the death of Lady Eleanor Verity." The archivist, Mrs. Pritchard, raised an eyebrow. Lady Eleanor? That was a sad business indeed, a dark cloud over the family for years. What aspect interests you? "I'm researching the social history of the area, sir, the impact of such tragedies on local communities. Could you point me towards any newspaper reports from the time, or perhaps inquest records?" Mrs. Pritchard nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We have the local newspaper on microfilm, the Stonygate Gazette, and the coroner's inquest report should be in the public records, though it might be rather basic. Follow me." She led Miss Marple to a carrel equipped with a microfilm reader. Soon the spidery headlines from July 1952 flickered across the screen. "Tragedy at Stonygates. Lady Eleanor Verity found dead at foot of grand staircase. Coroner's verdict, accidental death. Heartbreak for the Verity family." Miss Marple scrolled through the articles, absorbing the details. Eleanor Verity, 28, beautiful, vivacious, beloved sister of the then-master Sir Richard Verity, found at the bottom of the grand staircase one morning by a housemaid. No witnesses. The official verdict? Accidental death, attributed to a loose tread on the stairs and a weak ankle Eleanor was known to have. The family was devastated, the community shocked. There were mentions of a young man Eleanor had been seeing, a local artist named Thomas Locke, but the articles were careful to state he was away in London at the time and had been cleared of any suspicion. The inquest report, when Mrs. Pritchard found it, was brief and perfunctory, echoing the newspaper's account. Misadventure. But Miss Marple's instincts prickled. It was too neat, too quickly closed, and the name Thomas Locke, it nagged at her. She asked Mrs. Pritchard if there were any subsequent reports. "Only the obituaries, I'm afraid, and a small piece a few years later. Locke, the artist, he died in prison, convicted of some other crime, forgery, I think, a troubled soul. Tragic end." Miss Marple thanked her and made a note. Thomas Locke, artist, Eleanor's suitor, died in prison? Forgery? Connection? The pieces were scattered, but a pattern was emerging. An accident quickly declared, a lover who died in disgrace, a family that closed ranks, and now, decades later, people connected to that time were dying. Back at the Palm Court Hotel, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The remaining tour members avoided each other, congregating only when necessary. Dinner was a silent, tense affair. Miss Marple, picking at her fish, noticed Joanna watching Professor Wanstead with unnerving intensity. Wanstead, for his part, seemed to be avoiding everyone, eating quickly and retreating to his room. Later, seeking a moment of quiet in the hotel's nearly empty lounge, Miss Marple found Mrs. Gable sitting alone by the window, staring out at the darkening square. Her face was tear-stained, her hands twisting a handkerchief into shreds.
"Mrs. Gable," Miss Marple said softly, approaching her, "may I join you? You seem very distressed." She jumped, then nodded miserably, gesturing to the opposite chair. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful, just awful. Poor Mr. Sanders. And now I'm terrified." "Terrified of what, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently, sitting down. Mrs. Gable leant forward, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Of the truth coming out. Of being blamed. Or worse." She glanced furtively around the deserted lounge. "You don't understand. I was there, at Stonygates, in 1952. I was Lady Eleanor's governess. Not for long, just after she came out. But I was there when it happened." Miss Marple kept her expression calm, encouraging. "That must have been dreadful for you. The inquest called it an accident?" Mrs. Gable let out a bitter, choked sound that was half sob, half laugh. "An accident? Oh, it was an accident, all right. An accident they wanted everyone to believe. But I saw things, Miss Marple, things that didn't add up. The argument the night before? The shouting? Sir Richard, he was furious with her. About something important. And Thomas Locke. He wasn't away in London. He was there, hiding in the gardens. I saw him. And the stair tread. It wasn't loose. I checked it myself afterwards. It was solid as a rock." She shuddered violently. "I knew it wasn't an accident. But who would listen to me? A mere Deverness? The verities were powerful. Sir Richard made sure the story stuck. Thomas Locke, they ruined him, framed him for that forgery to silence him. He died in prison, broken. And I ran. I took a position far away and never looked back until this tour." Fresh tears streamed down her face. "Harold Sanders was the barrister who helped Sir Richard cover it up. He knew the truth. He must have recognized me, or someone else did. And now he's dead, and I'm next. I know it."
The confession tumbled out, raw and desperate. Miss Marple listened intently, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The cover-up, the framing of Thomas Locke, Mrs. Gable's eyewitness account, Sanders' role as the legal fixer. And now someone was eliminating the people who knew the truth about Eleanor's murder. Because that's what it was, murder, not accident. "Who else knew, Mrs. Gable?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Besides you and Mr. Sanders, who else was involved in covering it up?" Mrs. Gable wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "Sir Richard, of course. He's dead now. Lady Elizabeth, his wife. She knew. She must have. And Professor Wanstead. He wasn't a professor then. He was Dr. Wanstead, the family physician. He signed the death certificate. He declared it an accident without a proper post-mortem. He was part of it. He had to be." She lowered her voice even further. And there was a solicitor, not Thorne, someone else, older. He handled the legal side of silencing Locke. I don't recall his name, but Thorne, he's a solicitor. Maybe he knows something. Or maybe he's just here." She trailed off, overwhelmed. Miss Marple absorbed this. Wanstead as the complicit doctor, Lady Elizabeth as the knowing wife, an unknown solicitor, and Thorne, possibly connected, possibly just collateral. And Michael and Joanna. What was their role? Mrs. Gable hadn't mentioned them. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Gable," Miss Marple said, her voice firm and reassuring. "You were very brave. We must go to Inspector Davies with this, immediately." "No," Mrs. Gable gasped, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "No. If I go to the police, whoever killed Harold will know I've talked. They'll silence me for good. Please, Miss Marple, promise you won't tell anyone yet. Just be careful. Watch them. Especially Wanstead. And the young woman, Joanna. There's something cold about her, something not right. Reluctantly, Miss Marple nodded. Very well, Mrs. Gable, for now. But we must be vigilant, and we must find a way to get this information to the authorities safely. After escorting the trembling Mrs. Gable to her room and ensuring she locked the door, Miss Marple returned to her own. The weight of the knowledge was immense. Eleanor Verity had been murdered, likely by her own brother, Sir Richard, with the active collusion of Dr. Wanstead, now professor, and a solicitor, and the passive complicity of Lady Elizabeth. Sanders' barrister had helped bury the truth and frame Thomas Locke. Now someone was eliminating everyone involved in that cover-up. Sanders was first. Mrs. Gable feared she was next. Who else? Wanstead? Lady Elizabeth? Thorne? And who was the killer? Someone seeking vengeance for Thomas Locke, or someone else with a stake in keeping the past buried? The knock on her door was sharp, unexpected. Miss Marple tensed, then opened it cautiously. Inspector Davies stood there, his expression grave. "Miss Marple, a moment, please. May I come in?" He entered without waiting for a full invitation, closing the door behind him. He held a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a gentleman's silver pocket watch. It was engraved. He held the bag closer to the light. Miss Marple read the inscription. "To each S, with gratitude for discretion, E.V." E.V., Davies stated flatly. Eleanor Verity. Given to Sanders by Eleanor Verity herself, for discretion. That puts a rather different complexion on his relationship with the family, wouldn't you say? And his presence on this tour. He wasn't just a tourist. He was connected, deeply connected, to Eleanor, and likely to whatever happened to her. Miss Marple met his gaze. "Indeed, Inspector. It seems Mr. Sanders possessed knowledge that someone was willing to kill to keep secret. And I suspect," she added, her voice dropping, "that Harold Sanders was not the first person connected to that secret to die recently, nor will he be the last." Davies' eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" "Think, Inspector," Miss Marple urged. "The tour group. Professor Wanstead, the historian who knows the house too well and tried to shut down any mention of Eleanor. Mrs. Gable, the governess who was there in 1952 and is now terrified. Mr. Thorne, the solicitor, who might have connections to the original legal machinations. Even the young couple, Michael and Joanna. Their story feels rehearsed, and Joanna watches everyone like a hawk. They all have threads leading back to Stonygates and Eleanor Verity. Sanders was silenced because he knew too much, or because he was about to talk. The killer is eliminating the loose ends from that original conspiracy, one by one." Davies stared at her, the implication sinking in. A systematic purge, after all these years. Why now? Perhaps because someone found out the truth, Miss Marple speculated. Thomas Locke's family, an heir seeking justice. Or perhaps someone within the original group is trying to eliminate the others to save themselves. Either way, Inspector, everyone in that tour group, except perhaps Michael and Joanna, is a potential target, and the killer is still among us, watching, waiting. Davies looked towards the door, his expression grim. "Mrs. Gable, she's a wreck. Thorne seems confused. Wanstead is a block of ice. The Farrells, I don't know." He turned back to Miss Marple. "You see things, Miss Marple, things others miss. I need your eyes, your mind. This is bigger than a simple murder. It's a web of deceit spun over decades, and someone is cutting through it with a knife." Miss Marple nodded slowly, the chilling realization solidifying within her. It wasn't just about solving Sanders' murder anymore. It was about uncovering a decades-old conspiracy, identifying a killer driven by vengeance or fear, and preventing more deaths. The watch, engraved with Eleanor's initials, was the key that unlocked the past, and the past, Miss Marple understood with chilling certainty, was about to claim more victims. She looked at Inspector Davies, her blue eyes sharp and resolved. "Then we must unravel it, Inspector, before anyone else dies, before the web ensnares us all." She didn't add the thought that had just struck her with icy clarity. "And the killer decides that the observant old lady knitting in the corner knows too much as well." The twisted plot was tightening, and Miss Marple was no longer just an observer. She was perilously close to becoming its next target.
Chapter 5. Ghosts from the Past. The dust motes, dancing in the slanting afternoon light of Eleanor Verity's abandoned chamber, seemed heavier than mere particles. They felt like fragments of time, suspended in the air Miss Marple now breathed. Air thick with secrets, betrayal, and the lingering perfume of lavender and despair. The letters, brittle with age and weighted with devastating truth, lay spread across the faded chaise lounge like pieces of a shattered soul. Miss Marple sat rigidly in a straight-backed chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap, her mind reeling under the impact of Eleanor's final desperate words. "Richard found the ledgers. He saw the transfers. He called me a fool, a traitor to the family name. He screamed that I would destroy everything. I told him I would expose him, that the Verity legacy shouldn't be built on stolen funds." He went white, then cold. "You will not, Eleanor," he said. "You will not shame us. You will not destroy me." That was last night. I fear him, Jane. Truly fear him. If anything happens to me, know it was not an accident. No, Richard did this. And tell Thomas, tell him his child will be cared for. Tell him I loved him. The words burned themselves into Miss Marple's consciousness. Eleanor Verity hadn't just fallen, she'd been pushed by her own brother, Sir Richard Verity, to silence her exposure of his embezzlement from the family estate. Pushed to protect his wealth and his precious, corrupt legacy. And Thomas Locke, the artist, the lover framed for forgery and left to rot in prison, was the father of Eleanor's unborn child, a child born after its mother's murder, raised in secret. The magnitude of the injustice was staggering. A life snuffed out, another ruined, an orphaned child hidden away, all to protect a fortune built on lies. Miss Marple carefully refolded the letters, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. She slipped them back into the hidden compartment behind the loose paneling, replacing the miniature portrait. The evidence was secure, but the knowledge was a dangerous burden. She needed to get this to Inspector Davies immediately. Yet even as the thought formed, a cold prickle traced its way down her spine. She was no longer just an observer. She was a threat. The killer, the architect of this decades-long cover-up, or the avenger, now picking apart its threads, knew she was here, knew she was digging. Harold Sanders was dead because he knew too much. Mrs. Gable was terrified for the same reason. How long before the killer decided she knew too much? She rose, her joints protesting, and moved towards the door, her senses hyper-alert. The silence of Stonygates felt different now, not just ancient, but watchful. She descended the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick runner, her eyes scanning the shadows in the corners, the landings above. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pollock, a plump woman with a perpetually worried expression, was dusting a hall table downstairs. "Ah, Miss Marple," Pollock said, her voice hushed. "Finding everything all right? Lady Elizabeth is resting upstairs. She's been quite overcome by recent events." Her eyes darted nervously towards the library door, still sealed with police tape.
"Quite all right, thank you, Mrs. Pollock," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "Such a tragic business. One can only hope the inspector finds answers soon." She kept her tone light, conversational, but her mind raced. Lady Elizabeth, resting, or listening. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns. Miss Marple walked briskly towards the spot where the police had parked their vehicles, intending to find Davies. As she rounded a clipped yew hedge near the old stables, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows of the stable doorway. Professor Wanstead. He stepped into her path, blocking the way forward. His usual icy composure was fractured. His faded denim eyes were wide, almost feverish, and a fine sheen of sweat glistened on his high forehead despite the cool air. He looked less like a detached academic and more like a cornered animal. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, strained, devoid of its usual clipped precision. "A word, please." "Professor Wanstead," Miss Marple replied, stopping a few feet from him. She kept her expression neutral, her hands clasped loosely before her, but every nerve was taut. "Is something the matter? You look unwell." "Unwell?" He gave a harsh, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Perceptive, as always. Yes, Miss Marple, I am profoundly unwell. I am terrified." He glanced furtively over his shoulder, then back at her, his gaze intense, pleading. "Sanders, that was no accident. We both know it. And you were asking questions, at the archives, about Eleanor, about Locke." Miss Marple remained silent, letting him talk. The confession was coming. "I know what you found," Wanstead pressed, taking a half-step closer. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The truth about 1952, about what really happened to Eleanor." "And what did really happen, Professor?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her voice steady. Wanstead flinched as if struck. He looked away, towards the darkening windows of the manor house. "It was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. That's what the inquest said. That's what I signed. That's the truth." "Was it, Professor?" Miss Marple persisted gently. "Or was it the truth Sir Richard Verity needed everyone to believe? The truth that protected his reputation and his finances?" Wanstead's head snapped back to her, his eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. You know about the ledgers? About the discrepancies?" His voice was barely audible now. "I know Eleanor discovered her brother was stealing from the family estate," Miss Marple stated, watching his reaction closely. "I know she threatened to expose him, and I know she died the very next day. An accidental fall conveniently silenced her and allowed Sir Richard to continue his theft while framing an innocent man to distract from the real crime." Wanstead swayed on his feet. He reached out, bracing himself against the rough stone wall of the stable. The color drained from his face, leaving it gray and gaunt. "Oh, God," he whispered, the words ragged. "You know everything. How could you possibly?" "Eleanor left letters, Professor," Miss Marple said softly, "hidden in her room. Letters written to her cousin, Jane. Letters detailing Richard's threats and her fears for her life. Letters naming Thomas Locke as the father of her unborn child."
Wanstead closed his eyes, a low moan escaping his lips. It was a sound of utter despair, of a lifetime of carefully constructed lies collapsing around him. Letters. She always was a meticulous record-keeper, even in extremis. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound, ancient weariness. Yes, it's true, all of it.
Richard, he was consumed by greed and by pride. The Verity name was everything to him. Eleanor discovering his theft, it was intolerable. He came to me that night, after the argument. He was unhinged, raging. He said Eleanor had lost her senses, that she would ruin them all. He begged me, commanded me, to ensure the death certificate was straightforward. No fuss, no questions. He promised it would be worth my while. A substantial donation to my research, a position secured. I was weak, Miss Marple, ambitious, terrified of him. I signed the papers. I declared it an accident. I helped bury the truth. He slumped against the wall, the confession draining the last of his resistance. And Locke? Richard framed him beautifully, planted forged bills of sale in his studio, made it look like Locke was selling fake Verity heirlooms. The evidence was convincing. I knew it was a lie, but I said nothing. I let an innocent man die in prison to protect Richard's secret and my own cowardice. Miss Marple looked at the broken man before her. The architect of the cover-up, yes, but also a victim of his own weakness and Richard's ruthless manipulation. And Harold Sanders? She asked. What was his role? Sanders? Wanstead spat the name like poison. The barrister, Richard's legal attack dog. He handled the framing of Locke, made sure the charges stuck, the evidence was presented damningly. He also managed the estate's finances after Richard's death, ensured the embezzled funds were well hidden, laundered through various accounts. He knew everything. He was Richard's most loyal and most dangerous servant. Why he came on this tour, I don't know. Perhaps he suspected the past was resurfacing. Perhaps he was trying to gauge the threat. Or perhaps someone lured him here to silence him permanently. The implication hung heavy in the cooling air. Someone had lured Sanders here, someone who knew the secrets and was now eliminating those who shared them. Wanstead had just confessed his part. Was he next? Was she? You must tell Inspector Davies this, Professor, Miss Marple urged, her voice firm. Now, before anyone else gets hurt, before the killer decides you've talked too much. Wanstead pushed himself away from the wall, straightening his jacket with a gesture that was almost reflexive, but the tremor in his hands remained. Davies? Yes, I must. But, Miss Marple, be careful. You've uncovered the truth. That makes you a target, a very dangerous target. The person who killed Sanders, they won't hesitate. They've waited decades for this, for vengeance or to protect the secret. Either way, they are ruthless. He looked at her, a flicker of his old intensity returning, mixed with genuine fear. Watch your back. Trust no one, especially not the ones who seem least threatening. His gaze lingered for a moment on the manor house. Then he turned and hurried away towards the police vehicles, his posture rigid, a man walking towards his own reckoning. Miss Marple watched him go, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. His warning echoed her own fears. She needed to get back to the Palm Court, to speak to Mrs. Gable, to warn her, to plan how to safely get all this information to Davies. But first, she needed to check on Joanna and Michael. Their reactions to Wanstead's arrest, or even just his heightened tension, could be revealing. She found them in the Palm Court's lounge, a large, airy room overlooking the square. Michael was staring blankly out the window, his face pale and drawn, his usual vitality extinguished. Joanna sat beside him on a sofa, her posture perfectly composed, but her green eyes held a watchful, almost predatory gleam as they scanned the room. They landed on Miss Marple when she entered. "Miss Marple," Joanna said, her voice smooth as silk, "you've been at Stonygates? Any developments?" "Professor Wanstead is speaking with Inspector Davies," Miss Marple replied, choosing her words carefully as she sat in an armchair opposite them. "He appears to have had a distressing realization regarding the historical aspects of the case." Michael flinched at the word historical. He turned from the window, his eyes haunted. Historical, is that all it is to them? A history lesson? People are dying, Miss Marple. Harold Sanders is dead, and it wasn't natural causes.
We all know it." He cracked with suppressed emotion. "And Mrs. Gable, she's terrified. Wanstead looks like he's seen a ghost. What's really going on? What happened at Stonygates in 1952? Joanna placed a calming hand on Michael's arm, but her eyes never left Miss Marple's face. "Steady, Michael. It's a police matter. We should let them handle it." There was an edge to her voice, a subtle warning. "The police are handling it, Miss Marple," agreed calmly, meeting Joanna's gaze directly. "But sometimes understanding the past helps illuminate the present. Eleanor Verity's death, for instance. It seems it was more than just a tragic accident." Michael leaned forward, his desperation palpable. What was it? Joanna's hand tightened on Michael's arm. "Michael, don't! Miss Marple is just speculating. We shouldn't pry." "Pry?" Michael shook off her hand, his frustration boiling over. "Harold Sanders is dead. Someone might come after Mrs. Gable next. Or anyone. Don't you care? Don't you want to know why?" He looked at Joanna with a mixture of hurt and accusation. "Of course I care, Michael," Joanna said, her voice losing some of her smoothness, a flicker of something harder showing through. "But panic helps no one. We need to be calm. Let the authorities do their job." Miss Marple observed the exchange with keen interest. Michael's anguish seemed genuine, born of fear and a desire for truth. Joanna's composure, however, felt like a shield. Was she protecting Michael or protecting herself? "The past has a way of resurfacing, Mr. Farrell," Miss Marple said gently, addressing Michael. "Especially when secrets are involved. Secrets people have killed to protect, or killed to avenge." The word avenged hung in the air. Joanna's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Michael looked bewildered. "Avenge? Avenge what? Eleanor's death? But that was an accident." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked softly, her gaze shifting to Joanna. "Or was it a murder covered up? And if it was murder, then who might seek justice after all these years?" Joanna stood up abruptly, her movements fluid but tense. "This is unhelpful speculation, Miss Marple. Michael is upset. We should go to our room." She took Michael's arm, her grip firm this time. Michael allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, but he looked back at Miss Marple, his eyes pleading. "Please, if you know anything at all." "Knowledge is a burden," Miss Marple said quietly, "especially when it involves the destruction of innocent lives. Sometimes the weight of it is crushing." She looked pointedly at Joanna as she spoke. Joanna's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. She steered Michael towards the exit, her back ramrod straight. "Good night, Miss Marple." Miss Marple watched them go, the pieces clicking into place with chilling clarity. Joanna's unnatural composure, her watchfulness, her attempts to control the flow of information, her reaction to the idea of vengeance, Michael's grief and confusion. The letters had mentioned Eleanor's unborn child, a child raised in secret. Who else would have such a vested interest in uncovering the truth, in seeing justice done for Eleanor and Thomas Locke? Who else would have the patience, the intelligence, and the cold determination to orchestrate this elaborate confrontation?
"The child will be cared for. Tell him I loved him," Eleanor's words echoed. That child would be an adult now, perhaps in their late 60s. Joanna looked younger, but appearances could be deceptive. Or perhaps Joanna was the child of that child, the grandchild seeking justice for their murdered grandmother and wrongfully imprisoned grandfather. The timing fit, the intensity fit, the cold, calculated fury fit. Miss Marple felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill. If she was right, Joanna wasn't just part of the tour group. She was Nemesis personified. She was the architect of the twisted plot Jason Raphael had sent her to uncover. And she was sitting right beside Michael, manipulating him, using him as cover. The realization was followed by a surge of cold fear. Joanna knew Miss Marple was close. She'd seen it in her eyes. If Joanna was the killer, eliminating the one person who could expose her, The observant old lady would be her next logical step. Miss Marple needed to act, and fast. She needed to get to Inspector Davis with everything, the letters, Wanstead's confession, her suspicions about Joanna. But could she reach him before Joanna struck? As she rose to go to her room, a folded piece of paper slipped out from under her door. It hadn't been there when she'd left for Stonygates. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. It was plain paper, no watermark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, blocky and deliberate, as if disguised. It contained only 3 words: the clock tower, midnight, alone. A summons, or a trap. Miss Marple stared at the note, the implications chillingly clear. Joanna knew she knew, and Joanna wanted to finish this. The clock tower. Stonygates had a clock tower, part of the old gatehouse, isolated and rarely visited. Midnight, alone. It was a challenge, a confrontation, or an invitation to a silent, permanent fall. Miss Marple crumpled the note in her hand. Fear was a cold serpent coiling in her stomach, but beneath it, a steely resolve hardened. Jason Raphael had sent her to uncover Nemesis. It seemed Nemesis had now decided to reveal herself. Miss Marple wouldn't run. She would go, but she wouldn't go unprepared. And she wouldn't go alone. She needed help. She needed to get a message to Inspector Davis, discreetly, urgently. She also needed to warn someone, anyone, who might listen. Mrs. Gable? Michael? But Michael was likely compromised by Joanna. Mrs. Gable was too fragile. Wanstead was with Davis. Her mind raced. The note demanded she come alone, but the killer didn't play fair. Neither would she. She had hours until midnight, hours to plan, to find an ally, to ensure that if she walked into a trap, the truth would still come out. The ghosts of the past, Eleanor, Thomas Locke, their unborn child, were crying out for justice, and Miss Marple, despite her age and the palpable danger, was the only one left who could answer their call. She looked towards the darkening square outside her window, the face of the clock tower barely visible in the distance. The darkest hour was approaching, and she would meet it head-on. The twisted plot was about to reach its climax, and she would be there to see it unravel, even if it meant walking into the heart of the storm.
Chapter 6. The Second Victim. The note lay on Miss Marple's escritoire like a coiled viper, its blocky letters seeming to writhe in the lamplight. The clock tower, midnight, alone. 3 words that crackled with menace, a summons from the shadows. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Miss Marple's composure, but it was quickly submerged beneath a surge of icy resolve. Joanna, or whoever had sent it, wanted her isolated, vulnerable. Miss Marple had no intention of obliging. Time was a luxury she didn't possess. Midnight was hours away, but the net was tightening. Mrs. Gable was a trembling wreck in her room. Michael was likely under Joanna's influence. Wanstead was spilling his guts to Davies, and the killer was moving with ruthless efficiency. She needed to act, to warn, to prepare. First, a message. She couldn't risk the hotel switchboard. Instead, she scribbled a brief, cryptic note on hotel notepaper. Inspector Davies, urgent, clock tower, midnight, Nemesis revealed, letters secure, -J-M. She slipped it into an envelope addressed to him at the local police station. Finding a young bellboy polishing brass in the deserted lobby, she pressed a coin into his hand. "Young man," she said, her voice low but urgent, "this must reach Inspector Davies at the station immediately. It's a matter of life and death. Tell no one you delivered it." The boy, wide-eyed at her intensity, nodded solemnly and sprinted out into the gathering dusk. Next, Mrs. Gable. Miss Marple knocked softly on her door.
After a long pause, it opened a crack, revealing Mrs. Gable's terrified, tear-streaked face. "Miss Marple, oh, thank heavens! I heard shouting earlier. Was it? "Calm yourself, Elspeth," Miss Marple said firmly, stepping inside and closing the door. The room was stifling, the curtains drawn tight. "Professor Wanstead is speaking with Inspector Davies. He has confessed his part in the cover-up. Sanders was murdered, Eleanor was murdered, and Thomas Locke was framed. We have proof, letters Eleanor hid." Mrs. Gable gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Letters? Proof? Oh, thank God! But who killed Harold? Who would—" "Someone seeking justice," Miss Marple said carefully. "Or someone protecting the secret still. But there's more." She took the crumpled summons note from her pocket. "I received this, tonight, midnight, the clock tower at Stonygates." Mrs. Gable's eyes widened in horror. "No, you can't go. It's a trap. They'll kill you." "I know it's likely a trap," Miss Marple agreed. "But I also know Inspector Davies will be there, thanks to my message. I won't go unprepared. But you, Elspeth, are in grave danger. You knew too much, just like Sanders. You must lock your door. Do not open it for anyone except me or Inspector Davies. Understand? Anyone." Mrs. Gable nodded frantically, her knuckles white as she clutched the doorframe. "I will, I swear. Oh, Miss Marple, be careful. Please be careful." "I will," Miss Marple promised. "Now, lock up and pray." She left Mrs. Gable bolting the door behind her, the sound echoing with grim finality down the dim corridor. As she walked back towards her own room, a figure emerged from the shadows near the ice machine. Michael. He looked haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, his usual charm utterly extinguished. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse, "have you seen Joanna? She went out hours ago, said she needed air, but she hasn't come back. And Mrs. Gable, I heard her crying. What's happening? Everyone's falling apart." Miss Marple studied him. Was this genuine concern, or part of Joanna's manipulation? "She will return when she is ready, Mr. Farrell," she said neutrally. "These are stressful times. It is wise to remain in your room, for your own safety." "My safety?" Michael gave a bitter laugh. "Harold Sanders is dead, poisoned, in a library, and you talk about safety. What is really going on? Miss Marple, Joanna won't tell me anything. She just says to trust her. But I don't know what to trust anymore. Was Eleanor Verity murdered? Is that why we're all here? Because someone found out?" Miss Marple hesitated. Michael's anguish seemed real, a raw nerve exposed. Could he be used? "The past has a way of catching up, Michael," she said gently, "especially when it involves great wrongs. Sometimes people seek to right those wrongs. Sometimes they seek to bury them deeper. The danger lies in not knowing which is happening." She looked him directly in the eye. "Do you trust Joanna, truly, with your life?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, his gaze dropping to the worn carpet. I love her, but since this tour started, she's changed, hardened, like she's playing a part. And the way she looked at Sanders, before he died, there was something in her eyes, cold, calculating. I told myself I was imagining it, but now—" He trailed off, his fear palpable. "Trust is a precious commodity, Mr. Farrell," Miss Marple said softly. "Especially now. Be very careful who you place it in." She left him standing in the dimly lit corridor, a portrait of shattered certainty, and continued to her room. The encounter had been revealing. Michael's love for Joanna was real, but so was his dawning terror. He was a loose cannon, potentially dangerous if Joanna tried to use him, or if he confronted her. The hours until midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Miss Marple didn't attempt to rest. Instead, she prepared. She emptied her knitting bag, placing the heavy brass knitting needles, surprisingly solid and sharp, within easy reach inside her cardigan sleeve. She slipped a small, powerful flashlight into her pocket.
She reviewed Eleanor's letters in her mind, memorizing key phrases, the damning evidence against Richard Verity and his accomplices. She mentally mapped the grounds of Stonygates, particularly the isolated clock tower near the old gatehouse. She planned her approach, not directly, but via the overgrown kitchen gardens, using the shrubbery for cover. She wouldn't go alone, but she would go first. She needed to see who arrived, to observe, before revealing herself. Just before 11, she slipped out of her room. The Palm Court was unnervingly quiet. Most guests were asleep or out. The corridor lights were dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows. She moved silently, her sensible shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. As she passed Mrs. Gable's door, she paused. Silence. Good. She hoped the woman had heeded her warning. She took the service stairs down to the deserted kitchen level, then slipped out through a delivery entrance into the cool night air. The moon was high and bright, casting sharp skeletal shadows across the hotel grounds and the road leading to Stonygates. The manor itself loomed in the distance, a dark hulking shape against the starlit sky. The clock tower, a separate square structure near the main gate, was clearly visible, its face pale in the moonlight. Miss Marple kept to the shadows, moving swiftly across the open ground towards the cover of the trees lining the road to Stonygates. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every hoot of an owl sounded unnaturally loud. Her senses were stretched taut, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. She reached the tree line and paused, scanning the road ahead. Empty. Good.
She moved through the woods parallel to the road, using the moonlight filtering through the leaves to guide her. The going was slower, tangled with brambles and roots, but it offered concealment. As she neared the Stonegates grounds, she heard the faint, rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel. A car, approaching the manor from the opposite direction. She froze, pressing herself against the rough bark of a large oak. Headlights swept across the driveway, illuminating the imposing facade of Stonegates for a moment, before disappearing around the side of the house, towards the service entrance. Unusual at this hour. A delivery? Or something else? Shaking off the distraction, she focused on her target, the clock tower. It stood about 50 yards from the main gate, separated from the manor house by a wide lawn and a tangle of overgrown rose bushes. It was a squat stone structure, its arched doorway dark and inviting. She approached cautiously, staying within the deep shadows cast by the tower itself and the nearby yew hedge. She found a concealed spot behind a thick clump of rhododendrons near the tower's base, where she could see the approach from 3 sides without being easily seen. She settled in to wait, the cold stone at her back, the flashlight ready in her pocket, the heavy knitting needles a solid weight in her sleeve. The only sounds were the wind sighing through the tower's stones and the frantic beating of her own heart. Midnight came and went with agonizing slowness. The moon climbed higher. Miss Marple's limbs grew stiff with cold and tension. Had it been a bluff? A diversion? Just as doubt began to creep in, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows near the manor's stable block and moved swiftly, silently across the lawn towards the clock tower. It was Joanna. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, her dark clothing blending into the night. She carried nothing visible, but Miss Marple sensed the coiled tension in her, the watchful alertness. Joanna reached the arched doorway of the tower and paused, scanning the surroundings with intense scrutiny. Miss Marple held her breath, willing herself to become part of the rhododendron. After a long moment, Joanna slipped inside the tower. Miss Marple waited. 5 minutes. 10. Still alone. Where was Davies? Had her message been intercepted, or was he waiting, watching elsewhere? Cautiously, she emerged from her hiding place and approached the tower entrance. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. Inside, absolute darkness. She pulled out her flashlight, clicked it on, and stepped into the void. The air inside the clock tower was cold, stale, and thick with the scent of dust, stone, and ancient grease. A narrow, spiral stone staircase wound upwards into darkness, disappearing above. The beam of her flashlight caught cobwebs glistening like silver lace, scuff marks on the worn steps, recent ones. Joanna was up there. Miss Marple began to climb, her footsteps echoing hollowly in the confined space, the sound unnaturally loud. She kept the flashlight pointed low, trying to minimize her visibility from above. The staircase seemed to climb forever. Halfway up, she passed the massive clock mechanism itself, a bewildering forest of brass gears and pendulums, silent and still in the moonless dark. The air grew colder. Finally, the staircase opened onto a narrow stone gallery encircling the upper chamber. Moonlight streamed through the open arches on all four sides, illuminating the space with a cold, silvery glow. And there, standing in the center of the gallery, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, was Joanna. She wasn't looking at Miss Marple. She was looking out over the moonlit grounds of Stonegates, her posture relaxed, almost contemplative. The wind whipped strands of her auburn hair across her face. "You took your time, Miss Marple," Joanna said, her voice calm, carrying easily in the stillness. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." Miss Marple stepped fully onto the gallery, keeping her distance, the flashlight beam trained on Joanna's back. "Nerve is not the issue, my dear. Prudence is. And I am rarely alone when facing Nemesis." Joanna turned slowly. Her face was in shadow, but her green eyes caught the moonlight, glittering like chips of ice. A small, cold smile touched her lips. Nemesis. Yes. Jason Raphael's little puzzle. He always did enjoy his dramatic flourishes. Did he tell you I was coming? Or did you figure it out all by yourself? Her tone was mocking, yet laced with a strange, fierce pride. "I figured it out," Miss Marple stated, her voice steady, despite the cold dread coiling in her stomach. "Eleanor Verity's letters, the child, the grandchild seeking justice for a murdered grandmother and a wrongfully imprisoned grandfather. Thomas Locke was your grandfather, and Eleanor your grandmother." Joanna's smile widened, but it held no warmth, only a terrifying intensity. Clever old woman. Yes, Thomas Locke, a brilliant artist, a gentle soul, destroyed by Richard Verity's greed and Harold Sanders' legal venom. And Eleanor, my grandmother, carrying my father when Richard pushed her down those stairs. My father, born in secret, raised in shame, denied his heritage, his birthright, all because Richard Verity valued his stolen fortune more than his sister's life, more than an innocent child's future. They stole everything from us, Miss Marple, everything. My grandfather died in prison, broken. My father lived and died a ghost, haunted by what was taken. I grew up on stories of injustice, on the bitter taste of ashes. Raphael found me before he died. He knew the truth. He knew I had the means, the intelligence, and the will to see this through. He set the board. I made the moves. The tour, luring them all here, Sanders, Wanstead, Mrs. Dable, even Thorne, perhaps, as collateral damage. And Michael? Joanna's expression softened almost imperceptibly when Michael's name was mentioned. Michael is innocent, a good man. I love him, but he wouldn't understand this, the necessity of it, the cleansing fire. He thinks it's a holiday, a history tour. I needed him here as cover, as normality. But he is not part of this. He will not be harmed. The possessive, protective note in her voice was chilling. Harold Sanders, you poisoned him. Cyanide in the mass?
Cyanide is quick, painless, more than he deserved, Joanna said flatly. He was Richard's loyal hound. He framed my grandfather, destroyed the evidence, helped launder the stolen money for decades. He knew the truth and lived comfortably on the proceeds of murder and theft. He got what he earned. And Mrs. Gable? Miss Marple asked, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She was just a frightened governess. She knew nothing, only what she saw. She saw Richard arguing with Eleanor. She saw my grandfather hiding in the gardens that night. She knew the stair tread wasn't loose, and she ran. She ran and hid and kept her silence for 50 years while my grandfather rotted and my father suffered. Her silence made her complicit. Fear is no excuse for cowardice when justice is at stake. She was a loose end. Loose ends must be tied. The cold finality in her voice was terrifying. Miss Marple felt a surge of anger. You call this justice, Joanna? This is vengeance, cold, calculated murder. You've become what you despise, a killer who silences those who stand in the way. Justice is a blade, Miss Marple. Joanna snapped, her composure cracking for a moment, revealing the raw fury beneath. It cuts both ways. Sometimes, to excise a cancer, you must cut deep. Richard Verity is dead, beyond earthly justice. Sanders is dead. Wanstead has confessed, his reputation ruined. Lady Elizabeth? She knew. She always knew. She profited from the theft, lived in luxury built on blood and lies. She will face her own reckoning soon. And Thorne? He was the junior solicitor who helped Sanders frame my grandfather. He knew the evidence was forged. He kept quiet for his career. He will not escape either. You plan to kill them all? Miss Marple asked, horrified.
Only those who actively participated in the cover-up, who profited from the injustice, who chose silence over truth, Joanna corrected, her voice regaining its chilling calm. The guilty, not the innocent. Unlike them, I draw the line. She took a step closer to Miss Marple, her green eyes boring into hers. Which brings us to you, Miss Marple. You found the letters. You pieced it together. You are dangerously close to the truth. A loose end I cannot afford. Miss Marple stood her ground, the heavy knitting needles feeling suddenly inadequate. Inspector Davies knows. He has my note. He knows about the letters, about Wanstead's confession. He knows to come here tonight. Joanna laughed, a short, humorless sound. Davies, a plodding policeman. He'll be searching the hotel grounds, maybe the manor. He won't think to look up here in the clock tower until it's far too late. By the time he climbs those stairs, she let the threat hang in the air. But I offer you a choice, Miss Marple, a respect for your age, your intellect. Walk away, now. Go back to your quiet village. Forget you ever heard of Stonygates, of Eleanor Verity, of Thomas Locke. Live out your remaining days in peace. I will not harm you. This is not your fight. The offer was tempting. The wind whistled through the arches, carrying the scent of distant rain. Below, the grounds lay silent and still. The weight of the secrets, the danger, pressed down on Miss Marple. She could walk away. Let Joanna have her vengeance. Let the chips fall where they may. But Jason Raphael's face flashed in her mind. His trust, his demand for justice. Eleanor's face pleading from the past. Thomas Locke dying in prison. The innocent child denied its heritage, Mrs. Gable's terror, Michael's shattered love, the cold, calculated evil of Joanna's plan, however justified she believed it to be. No, Miss Marple said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the wind and the tension. No, Joanna, I cannot walk away. Justice cannot be served by becoming the monster you hunt.
Vengeance is a poison that consumes the avenger as surely as the guilty. Raphael sent me to uncover the truth, not to witness more bloodshed. The truth will come out, through the courts, through the evidence, not through your private executions. Joanna's face hardened, the last vestige of anything resembling humanity vanishing from her eyes. They became flat, predatory. Foolish old woman, you had your chance. She moved with terrifying speed, not towards Miss Marple, but to the heavy iron bell rope hanging near one of the arches, the rope used to ring the clock bells. She grabbed it and pulled hard. A deafening clang shattered the night air, echoing across the grounds like a gunshot. It was a signal, or a distraction. As the reverberations died away, Joanna lunged, not at Miss Marple, but at the stone parapet beside her. With surprising strength, she heaved, and a large, loose coping stone, weakened by age and weather, tumbled free. It crashed down on the gallery floor with a thunderous roar, sending shards of stone flying. Miss Marple instinctively threw herself back against the wall, shielding her face as debris pelted her. Through the dust and settling echoes, she saw Joanna vanish through the archway opposite, disappearing down the spiral staircase with the swiftness of a shadow. The bell rope still swayed. Miss Marple coughed, dust coating her cardigan. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Joanna was gone, but the signal had been sent. To whom? And where was Davies? She stumbled to the parapet, peering down. Below, near the manor's service entrance, she saw figures moving in the moonlight. Police or someone else? Then a new sound reached her, cutting through the night, a sound that froze the blood in her veins. Not police sirens, but a woman's scream, high, piercing, and utterly terrified, coming from the direction of the Palm Court Hotel. Mrs. Gable. Joanna hadn't been signaling an accomplice at the tower, she'd been signaling someone else, someone back at the hotel, someone who had ignored Miss Marple's warning or found a way past the locked door. The second victim. While Joanna confronted Miss Marple at the tower, her accomplice, or perhaps Joanna herself, moving with impossible speed, had struck at the hotel. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the spiral staircase, her old legs protesting, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. She burst out of the tower door into the cold night and ran, not towards the manor, but back towards the Palm Court Hotel, driven by dread and the fading echo of that terrible scream. The twisted plot had claimed another life. And Miss Marple knew with chilling certainty that Joanna's deadly game was far from over. The clock tower had been a diversion, a demonstration of power. The real killing had happened while they talked. And the killer was still out there, hidden in the shadows.
Chapter 7. A pattern emerges. The scream ripped through the night, a raw, jagged sound of pure terror that tore at the fabric of Miss Marple's resolve. It came from the Palm Court Hotel, cutting through the distance between the clock tower and the square like a physical blow. Joanna's signal, the clanging bell, hadn't been for an accomplice at the tower. It had been a trigger for murder. While Miss Marple faced Joanna in the cold, moonlit heights, the killer had struck at the heart of their temporary sanctuary. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. Years of navigating St. Mary Mead's uneven pavements stood her in good stead as she ran, her sensible shoes pounding the damp road back towards the hotel. The moonlight cast grotesque, dancing shadows, turning familiar trees into grasping ghouls. Her lungs burned, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the cold dread propelling her was stronger than fatigue. Mrs. Gable, the terrified, broken woman who had placed her fragile trust in Miss Marple's warning. Had the killer found a way past the locked door? Or had Mrs. Gable, in her panic, opened it to the wrong person? She reached the hotel's forecourt just as the main doors burst open. Guests in various states of undress spilled out, drawn by the commotion. Inspector Davies, looking grim and harried, was striding towards the service entrance, 2 uniformed officers at his heels. He spotted Miss Marple immediately. "Miss Marple," he barked, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay back. Scene's being secured. 2nd floor, Mrs. Gable's room." "What happened?" Miss Marple demanded, breathless. "Fall," Davies said grimly. "From her balcony. It looks like she went over. Housekeeper found her when she didn't answer the door for a welfare check after the scream." His eye scanned Miss Marple's dust-covered cardigan and disheveled hair. "Where the hell have you been? We got your note. I had men searching the grounds at Stonygates for an hour. Nothing at the clock tower until we heard the scream." "The clock tower was a diversion, Inspector," Miss Marple gasped, leaning against the cold brick wall to steady herself. "Joanna was there. She confessed everything. Eleanor's murder, Locke's framing, her vengeance. She rang the bell as a signal. To someone here, to kill Mrs. Gable while she kept me occupied." Davies's face hardened. "Joanna Farrell. She's Michael's wife. They were in the lounge when we bought the call. Said they'd been there all evening. Alibi checked out by the night clerk." He paused, his eyes narrowing. But the bell. Timing. Damn it. We need to talk to her now. And Michael. "Michael may not know," Miss Marple said quickly. "He seemed genuinely distraught earlier. Joanna's been using him as cover, but we need to be careful. She's dangerous, Inspector. And she's not alone. She has an accomplice, someone who could access Mrs. Gable's room." Davies nodded curtly. "We're bringing them both in for questioning, separately. You too, Miss Marple, as soon as we've secured the scene." He turned and disappeared into the hotel, barking orders into his radio. Miss Marple was escorted to a small private lounge off the main lobby. Minutes later, Michael Farrell was brought in, looking pale and shell-shocked. He sank into a chair, running a shaking hand through his hair. "Miss Marple, they say Mrs. Gable fell. Jumped? Is it true? How? Why?" "I fear it was neither accident nor suicide, Michael," Miss Marple said gently. "She was murdered, pushed from her balcony, just like Harold Sanders was poisoned." Michael's face crumpled. "Murdered? But who? Why? This is insane. Joanna's with the police. They're questioning her. She's devastated. She said she heard the scream too." "Did she, Michael?" Miss Marple asked softly, watching his reaction closely. "Did she hear it before or after the bell rang from Stonygate's clock tower?" Michael frowned, confused. "The bell? What bell? I didn't hear any bell. Joanna and I were in the lounge, reading. We heard the scream like everyone else." Miss Marple's heart sunk. Joanna's alibi was airtight, for Michael at least. He genuinely didn't hear the bell, meaning Joanna had likely slipped away from him briefly, or timed her absence perfectly. Or perhaps the accomplice had acted entirely independently, triggered by the bell Joanna rang remotely. The possibilities were chilling. "Michael," Miss Marple said, leaning forward, her voice low and urgent, "I need you to think carefully. Joanna, has she seemed different lately? Distant? Preoccupied? Have you noticed her leaving your room at odd hours, or receiving strange messages?" Michael looked tormented. She has been tense since Sanders died, but I thought it was just the shock. She said she needed air sometimes, late at night. I never thought, oh God, you think Joanna had something to do with this? With Mrs. Gable? With Sanders? It's impossible. She loves me. She couldn't. Love can be a powerful motivator, Michael. For good or for terrible deeds. Joanna believes she is delivering justice for her grandparents, Eleanor Verity and Thomas Locke. She believes Sanders, Wanstead, Mrs. Gable, and others were complicit in their deaths and the cover-up. She told me so herself. Tonight. Michael looked up, his eyes wide with dawning horror and disbelief. Her grandparents? Eleanor Verity? Thomas Locke? But that means she's... He couldn't finish the sentence, the implications crashing over him. The woman he loved was the architect of the nightmare engulfing them. Before he could respond, the door opened. Inspector Davies stood there, his expression grim. Miss Marple, Mr. Farrell. Joanna Farrell maintains she was with Michael all evening. The night clerk confirms they were in the lounge around the time of the scream, though he did see Joanna step outside for a breath of air for about 10 minutes, roughly 20 minutes before the scream. Not enough time to get to Stony Gates and back, obviously, but enough time to, well, access a second-floor balcony. He looked pointedly at Michael. Michael just stared, devastated. We're checking hotel security footage, but the cameras cover the lobby and exits, not individual corridors or balconies. Forensics are examining Mrs. Gable's room and the balcony now. Preliminary findings suggest the balcony railing was recently tampered with, a loose spindle, possibly weakened deliberately. And... Davies paused, his gaze fixing on Miss Marple. We found something tucked under Mrs. Gable's pillow. A note. Block letters, just like yours. He held out an evidence bag. Inside was a small piece of hotel notepaper, 3 words, written in the same deliberate, disguised script as the note Miss Marple had received. Silence is golden. Miss Marple felt a chill deeper than the night air. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message, a taunt directed at her, a warning that her own loose end was next. Joanna? Michael whispered, his voice breaking. Or her accomplice, Davies said grimly. Someone who knew Mrs. Gable was scared, who knew she might talk, who wanted to send a message to the rest of us. He looked at Miss Marple. Your theory about an accomplice seems disturbingly plausible. Who? Who else has a connection to this? Who wasn't with the group when Sanders died? Mr. Thorne, Miss Marple said immediately. He was wandering off, looking at porcelain. He seemed distracted, confused, but he's a retired solicitor. What if that confusion is an act? What if he was the junior solicitor who helped Sanders frame Locke? Joanna mentioned him. He'd have motive to silence Mrs. Gable if he feared exposure.
Thorne's in his room, said Davies. Sedated by the hotel doctor after Sanders' death. Said the shock was too much. We've had an officer outside his door. He couldn't have done this. Then who? Michael demanded, his voice rising. Who else is there? Davies' gaze swept the room, lingering on the door. Lady Elizabeth Verity. She's staying at her townhouse in London, but it's only an hour away. She has resources, connections, and she knew everything. Joanna said she'd face his reckoning. Maybe Lady Elizabeth decided to strike first, eliminate threats before Joanna could get to her. Or maybe she's working with Joanna. Unlikely, but possible. The list of suspects was shrinking, yet the danger felt more immediate than ever. Joanna was the spider at the center of the web, but she had threads extending to unknown accomplices or co-conspirators. Mrs. Gable was dead. Wanstead was in custody, singing like a canary. Thorne was incapacitated. Lady Elizabeth was a remote possibility. That left Michael, broken and bewildered, and Joanna herself, currently maintaining her alibi with chilling composure in another room. We need to pressure Joanna, Miss Marple said, her mind racing. She's arrogant. She believes she's smarter than us. We need to show her we know the pattern. We know about the accomplice. We know about the weakened railing. We need to shake her confidence.
"How?" Davies asked. "She's not talking, just demanding a lawyer." "By confronting her with the evidence of her method," Miss Marple said, a plan forming. "The cyanide for Sanders, quick, painless, professional. The tampered railing for Mrs. Gable, making it look like accident or suicide, plausible deniability. The notes, block letters, disguised. She's meticulous, she plans, she leaves signatures. We show her we see them. We show her we understand her aesthetic of vengeance. And we dangle the one thing she might still want, the chance to confront the remaining guilty parties face to face, to see their fear before the end." Davies frowned. "A confrontation? Here? Now? Too risky." "Not here," Miss Marple corrected, her eyes gleaming with fierce determination. "At Stonegates, tomorrow night, a dinner party. Invite the remaining players, Lady Elizabeth, we can insist she attend, Professor Wanstead, under guard, Mr. Thorne if he's recovered, Michael and Joanna, and me, and you, Inspector, with your men discreetly placed. We tell Joanna it's her chance to present her case, to expose the truth before we all go to the authorities. She won't be able to resist the drama, the chance to see her victims squirm. It's the stage she's been waiting for, and it will be the perfect trap." Davies considered it, his fingers drumming on the back of a chair. "It's audacious, dangerous as hell. If she suspects—" "She won't," Miss Marple stated, with more confidence than she felt. "Her arrogance is her weakness. She believes she's in control. She'll see it as her triumph, and we'll be waiting. We'll have the letters from Eleanor as the ultimate weapon, and we'll watch her, watch everyone. The accomplice, if they come, will reveal themselves. The pattern will complete itself there." After a long moment, Davies nodded slowly. "All right, Miss Marple, we'll set the trap. Stonegates, tomorrow night. Dinner for 6, plus the police. Let's see if Nemesis takes the bait." The next day passed in a blur of tense preparations. Inspector Davies, leveraging his authority and the gravity of the situation, persuaded a reluctant and visibly frightened Lady Elizabeth Verity to attend a debriefing dinner at Stonegates the following evening, citing the need to clarify historical matters arising from the ongoing investigation. Professor Wanstead, released on bail under strict police guard, agreed, perhaps seeing a chance to mitigate his own fate. Mr. Thorne, deemed medically stable but deeply shaken, was also informed of the gathering. Michael, Farrell, shattered but resolute, confirmed he and Joanna would attend. Joanna herself, when informed by Davies of the debriefing at Stonegates, where she could present her perspective, accepted with a cool, enigmatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How thoughtful, Inspector. A fitting setting," she murmured. Miss Marple spent the day in quiet contemplation, reviewing Eleanor's letters, memorizing details, planning her words for the confrontation. She also made a discreet visit to the hotel's maintenance office under the pretense of reporting a faulty lamp. There, she observed the security monitor feeds. While the corridor cameras were indeed limited, she noticed something crucial. The camera covering the service entrance and delivery bay had a clear, albeit distant view of the rear facade of the hotel, including the upper floor balconies. She requested and received a copy of the footage from the previous night, around the time Mrs. Gable died. Back in her room, she watched the grainy black and white images on her laptop. The timestamp ticked over. She saw the faint glimmer of the moonlight on the wet pavement. Then a figure moved in the shadows near the service entrance. Dressed in dark clothing, hood pulled low. The figure moved with purpose, not towards the main entrance, but towards a narrow, ill-lit alley running alongside the hotel. The angle was poor, but Miss Marple saw the figure pause, look up towards the second floor, and scale a drain pipe with surprising agility. It disappeared from view,
heading upwards in the direction of Mrs. Gable's balcony. Miss Marple froze the frame. The figure was slight, definitely not the bulky Mr. Thorne. The build, it could be a woman, Joanna. But Joanna had an alibi with Michael, unless Michael was lying, or unless the accomplice wasn't Joanna. She enhanced the image as best she could. The hood obscured the face, but the height, the build, it reminded her of someone else, someone who moved with quiet efficiency, who knew the hotel's layout, who had access. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pollock. She'd been at Stonegates when Miss Marple found Eleanor's letters. She'd seemed worried, nervous. Could she be connected, a servant of the Verities, loyal to Lady Elizabeth? Or perhaps Joanna had recruited her. The housekeeper would have keys, knowledge of routines, the perfect cover to move unseen. It was a theory, a fragile thread, but it was something. An accomplice, likely female, known to the hotel, possibly connected to the Verity household. She relayed this information to Davies via a secure line. Check Mrs. Pollock's background, Inspector, her movements last night, and have her watch discreetly at the dinner. If she's there, observe her interactions with Joanna and Lady Elizabeth. As twilight painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, Miss Marple prepared for the dinner at Stonegates. She chose a simple dress of deep blue wool, practical yet dignified. She slipped the heavy brass knitting needles into a specially sewn pocket inside her cardigan sleeve, a foolish, perhaps, but comforting weight. She reviewed Eleanor's letters one last time, tucking them securely into her handbag alongside her small flashlight. The pattern was clear now. Joanna was the architect, driven by a twisted sense of generational justice. She eliminated those she deemed complicit in the original cover-up: Sanders, the fixer, Mrs. Gable, the silent witness. She used professional methods, poison, and staged accidents, tampered railing. She left taunting notes, and she had help, an accomplice, possibly Mrs. Pollock, acting on her behalf or Lady Elizabeth's. The remaining targets were gathered at Stonegates: Wanstead, the complicit doctor, Thorne, the junior solicitor, and Lady Elizabeth, the knowing matriarch. Joanna wanted to confront them, to see their fear, to deliver her verdict before the end. Miss Marple and Davies intended to give her that stage, and then spring the trap.
The drive to Stonegates was silent and tense. Davies drove, his knuckles white on the wheel. Miss Marple sat beside him, staring out at the darkening countryside, the imposing silhouette of the manor growing larger against the twilight sky. It felt like returning to the scene of the original crime, the place where the whole tragic chain of events had begun. The air crackled with anticipation, with the promise of revelation and the threat of violence. Stoneydage was illuminated against the night, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Mr. Harding, the steward, met them at the door, his usual impassivity replaced by a palpable tension. "Inspector, Miss Marple, everyone is assembled in the blue drawing-room. Drinks are served. Dinner will be announced shortly." They entered the blue drawing-room. The scene was surreal. Lady Elizabeth Verity sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her elegant silver hair coiffed perfectly, her face a pale, composed mask that couldn't quite hide the fear in her eyes. She clutched a sherry glass like a lifeline. Professor Wanstead stood by the fireplace, looking gaunt and haunted, flanked by a plainclothes officer who tried to look inconspicuous. Mr. Thorne sat hunched on a sofa, looking smaller and more bewildered than ever, his gaze darting nervously. Michael and Joanna stood together near the window. Michael looked pale, his expression strained, his hand resting lightly on Joanna's arm as if for support. Joanna, however, was the picture of calm composure. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her auburn hair swept up, her green eyes scanning the room with cool, assessing interest. She acknowledged Miss Marple and Davies with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Inspector Davies," Lady Elizabeth said, her voice brittle, "I trust this
Debriefing will be brief. The circumstances are most distressing. Quite, Lady Elizabeth, Davies replied smoothly. We aim to clarify matters concerning the historical events connected to your family, particularly those relevant to the recent tragedies. Miss Marple has uncovered some pertinent information. All eyes turned to Miss Marple. Joanna's gaze was particularly intense, a flicker of challenge in its depths. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice clear and calm, carrying easily in the hushed room. Recent events have cast a harsh light on the past. We now know with certainty that Lady Eleanor Verity did not die in an accident in 1952. She was murdered, pushed down the grand staircase by her brother, Sir Richard Verity, to silence her after she discovered his systematic embezzlement from the family estate and threatened to expose him. A collective gasp, though it sounded more like a choked intake of breath from Lady Elizabeth. Wanstead closed his eyes. Thorne whimpered softly. Michael stared at Joanna, who remained impassive. We know, Miss Marple continued, her gaze sweeping the room, that this murder was covered up, that Sir Richard, with the active assistance of his family physician, Dr. Alistair Wanstead, she nodded towards the professor, who falsified the death certificate, and his barrister, Harold Sanders, who not only helped bury the truth, but also framed Thomas Locke for forgery, ensuring his conviction and eventual death in prison. We know that a junior solicitor, likely Mr. Cedric Thorne here, assisted Sanders in fabricating the evidence against Locke. Thorne flinched violently. And we know that Lady Elizabeth Verity, she fixed her gaze on the matriarch, was aware of the truth, the cover-up, and the framing, and profited from the stolen fortune for decades, choosing silence over justice. Lady Elizabeth's mask finally cracked. Her face turned ashen. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like a trapped bird. The weight of this injustice, Miss Marple said, her voice softening slightly, has echoed through the generations. It has destroyed lives, and now it has claimed new victims. Harold Sanders, silenced by poison. Mrs. Elspeth Dable, the governess who witnessed Eleanor's final argument and knew the truth of the staircase, silenced by a fall from her balcony. Murders designed to look like accidents or natural causes, but murders nonetheless. Executed with cold precision by someone seeking vengeance for Thomas Locke and Eleanor Verity. By someone determined that the guilty should not escape judgment. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy, charged with dread and accusation. Her gaze finally settled on Joanna Farrell, who met it steadily, a small, almost triumphant smile touching her lips. The pattern is clear, Miss Marple stated, her voice ringing with quiet authority. The Avenger has systematically eliminated those directly involved in the original cover-up. 2 are dead. 2 remain in this room besides Lady Elizabeth. And the Avenger is here, among us, waiting, watching, ready to deliver the final act of her twisted plot. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on Joanna's. Isn't that right, Joanna? Or should I call you Nemesis? The game is almost over, but the final move is mine, and Inspector Davies. She gestured slightly towards the inspector, who gave an almost imperceptible signal to the officers positioned discreetly near the doors. The blue drawing room, with its silk hangings and elegant furniture, had become a courtroom. The ghosts of the past stood as silent witnesses. The pattern of death and vengeance had been laid bare. The trap was sprung. Now they waited to see how the spider would react when the web began to burn.
Chapter 8. The Dinner Party. The blue drawing room froze. Miss Marple's words, sharp and undeniable, hung in the air like shards of ice. The Avenger is here, among us. Her gaze, unwavering and piercing, locked on to Joanna Farrell. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the frantic ticking of a long case clock in the corner. each tick echoing like a hammer blow on the tense silence. Then Joanna moved, not with the fluid grace Miss Marple had witnessed at the clock tower, but with the sudden coiled violence of a cornered predator. Her hand, previously resting lightly on Michael's arm, snapped upwards. In it, clutched with chilling familiarity, was a small, dark pistol. It hadn't been concealed in her elegant dress. It must have been tucked into the sofa cushion beside her, waiting. "Enough!" Joanna's voice, usually smooth and controlled, cracked like a whip, laced with a fury that stripped away all pretense. The cool composure shattered, revealing the raw, wounded animal beneath. Her green eyes, now blazing with a terrifying intensity, swept the room, daring anyone to move. "Enough of your sanctimonious pronouncements, you dried-up old busybody!" She spat at Miss Marple, the pistol unwavering. "You think you understand? You think your neat little patterns and observations mean anything? You've poked your nose into a grief so deep, so ancient, you couldn't fathom its depths." Michael gasped, recoiling as if burned. "Joanna, no! What are you doing? Put that down!" His voice was thick with disbelief and terror. Lady Elizabeth gave a small, strangled cry, her sherry glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the polished parquet. She shrank back into her chair, her face a mask of pure, aristocratic horror. Professor Wanstead went rigid, his face turning the color of old parchment, his eyes fixed on the pistol with a mixture of fear and grim resignation. Mr. Thorne let out a whimper and slid off the sofa, curling into a ball on the floor, covering his head with his hands. Inspector Davies moved with surprising speed, his hand dropping subtly towards his own holster, concealed beneath his jacket. "Joanna, put the weapon down, now. This is over. You're surrounded." His voice was low, urgent, trying to project calm authority into the chaos. "Over?" Joanna laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of humor. "It's only just begun, Inspector. It began the moment Richard Verity pushed my grandmother down those stairs. It began when Harold Sanders twisted the law to hang my grandfather. It began when she jabbed the pistol towards Lady Elizabeth, who flinched violently, sat in her silk dresses and counted the blood money. When he, the pistol swung towards Wanstead, signed the death certificate for a few pieces of silver and a promotion. When he, she gestured contemptuously at the whimpering Thorne, helped forge the evidence that stole my grandfather's life and my father's birthright. It began then, and it ends now." Her eyes flickered back to Miss Marple, burning with a chilling mix of hatred and a perverse respect. "You found the letters. Clever! But you don't understand the need, the right of it. Justice wasn't coming from your courts, your laws. They were bought and paid for by Verity gold. So I became the law. I became the executioner. Sanders, cyanide. Quick, painless, more than he deserved. Mrs. Gable, a coward who ran and hid while my grandfather rotted. A loose end. The balcony, an accident waiting to happen. Silence is golden, Miss Marple, especially for those who value their miserable life over truth." She took a step forward, the pistol sweeping the room, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "And you, all of you, you thought you could hide behind time, behind your respectable facades, that the past wouldn't catch up? Richard is dead, beyond my reach. But you are the living architects of my family's destruction. You are the ones who will face the reckoning." The air crackled with lethal tension. Every eye was fixed on Joanna, on the deadly black hole of the pistol's barrel. Davies was tensed, ready to lunge. Miss Marple stood perfectly still, her mind racing, calculating angles, assessing the madness in Joanna's eyes. This wasn't just vengeance, it was a performance, a final terrible act on the stage she had meticulously built. She wanted them to see, to understand, before she pulled the trigger.
Joanna, Michael pleaded, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face. He took a hesitant step towards her, his hands outstretched, palms empty. Please, I love you. This isn't you. This isn't justice. This is madness. Think of what we could have. Please, put it down for me. For a fraction of a second, Joanna's resolve wavered. Her gaze flickered towards Michael, a flicker of something, pain, regret, crossing her face. It was the opening Davies needed. He moved, not towards Joanna, but towards the heavy silk drapes covering the large window to his left. With a powerful yank, he ripped them aside, flooding the room at the harsh glare of the security floodlights positioned in the gardens outside. The sudden blinding light caused everyone to flinch and cry out. "Now!" Davies bellowed. Simultaneously, the drawing room door burst open. 2 uniformed officers rushed in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The chaos was instantaneous. Joanna reacted with lightning speed, her momentary distraction vanishing. She didn't fire at Davies or the officers. Instead, she spun towards Michael, who was closest, her face contorted in a snarl of fury and betrayal. You pathetic fool! You ruined everything!" She pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, percussive crack that echoed like thunder. Time seemed to slow. Miss Marple saw Michael jerk backwards, a look of utter shock on his face, a dark stain blossoming instantly on the shoulder of his shirt. He cried out, stumbling back against the wall. "Michael!" Joanna screamed, the sound raw and anguished, a stark contrast to the fury of moments ago. It was a cry of horrified realization, of inadvertent consequence. In that split second of Joanna's distraction, of her scream for Michael, the world plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Not just the drawing room lights, but every light in the manor seemed to die at once. The sudden transition from blinding glare to pitch black was disorienting, terrifying. A woman's scream, Lady Elizabeth's, pierced the darkness. Wanstead shouted something incoherent. Thorne whimpered. Davies yelled, "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" The darkness was absolute, a physical presence. The smell of cordine hung heavy in the air, mixed with the scent of old wood and sudden, sharp fear. Miss Marple froze in the void, her senses straining in the void. She heard the scuffle of feet, a grunt of effort, the sound of a body hitting the floor hard. She heard Joanna's ragged breathing close by. She heard Michael's low moan of pain. She heard Davies yelling, "Joanna, drop it! It's over!" Then another sound cut through the chaos. A different kind of struggle. A gasp. A choked cry. Not Joanna's voice. Higher. Frailer. Mrs. Pollock? The housekeeper? Miss Marple's mind flashed to the security footage, the figure scaling the drain pipe. Had she been in the room all along? Hiding? Waiting? Before Miss Marple could react, before anyone could pinpoint the source in the impenetrable dark, a third shot rang out. Crack! It seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, echoing off the high ceiling. The sound was different, perhaps from a different weapon. It was followed instantly by a heavy thud, a final wet exhalation, and then silence. A profound, heavy silence, broken only by ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of hearts. Miss Marple stood frozen in the suffocating blackness, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging her nostrils. 3 shots, Michael wounded, someone else down. Joanna, Davies, the housekeeper? The darkness was a shroud, amplifying every rustle, every whimper into something monstrous. Lady Elizabeth's hysterical sobs cut through the silence like shards of glass. Wanstead was muttering prayers under his breath. Thorne was making a low, keening sound. Michael's breathing was shallow, pained. "Light!" Davies bellowed, his voice tight with command and urgency. "Someone get the emergency lights, now!" Scuffling sounds, fumbling in the dark. Then, a faint greenish glow flickered to life near the door, an emergency light strip, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like wraiths on the walls and ceiling.
The weak, eerie illumination revealed a scene of surreal horror. Michael Farrell was slumped against the wall, clutching his left shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His face was pale, etched with pain and shock, but he was conscious, his eyes wide and fixed on the center of the room. On the floor, near the spot where Joanna had been standing, lay Professor Wanstead. He was on his back, sightless eyes staring up at the ornate ceiling, a neat, dark hole in the center of his forehead. Blood was already
pooling beneath his head, soaking into the priceless Aldesan carpet. He looked utterly, profoundly surprised. And standing over Wanstead's body, holding a smoking, small-caliber pistol that looked absurdly delicate in her trembling hand, was Mrs. Pollock, the housekeeper. Her usual placid expression was gone, replaced by a mask of dazed horror and grim determination. Tears streamed down her plump cheeks, cutting tracks through the dust on her face. She stared down at Wanstead, then up at the stunned faces illuminated by the emergency light, her own pistol wavering slightly. He was going to shoot her," she stammered, her voice thick with tears and shock, gesturing vaguely toward where Joanna had been. "Lady Elizabeth, I heard everything. Through the servants' door. I couldn't let him kill my lady. Not after—" Her voice trailed off into a choked sob. She looked utterly lost, an ordinary woman transformed by circumstance into a killer. But where was Joanna? Miss Marple's eyes scanned the chaotic scene frantically. Lady Elizabeth was still in her chair, trembling violently, her eyes fixed on Wanstead's body. Thorne was still curled on the floor, whimpering. Davies was moving cautiously towards Mrs. Pollock, his own weapon drawn, speaking to her in low, urgent tones. Michael was bleeding against the wall. The officers by the door were shouting into their radios for backup and medical assistance. No Joanna!
A faint rustle came from behind the heavy velvet drapes Davies had pulled aside earlier, the ones shielding the large window. Miss Marple's head snapped toward the sound. She saw it then. A section of the heavy fabric near the floor was disturbed. A quick movement. A figure slipping silently through the gap, out into the floodlit gardens beyond. "Joanna!" Miss Marple cried out, pointing. "The window! She's escaping!" Davies whirled. "After her! Don't let her get away!" He barked orders to the officers, who immediately sprinted towards the window, wrenching the drapes fully aside and scrambling out into the night. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. Ignoring the chaos, the blood, the weeping, she moved swiftly towards Michael. "Mr. Farrell, Michael, are you badly hurt?" she asked, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her. Michael gritted his teeth, his face pale. "Shoulder. I think. Missed the bone. But, Joanna, Miss Marple, she shot me. She shot me!" The betrayal in his voice was devastating. "She's not herself, Michael," Miss Marple said firmly, ripping a section of lace from her handkerchief and pressing it firmly against the wound. The grief, the need for vengeance, it consumed her. "Hold this, tight. Help is coming." She kept her voice steady, an anchor in the storm. In the center of the room, Davies had secured Mrs. Pollock's weapon and was guiding the weeping housekeeper towards a chair. Lady Elizabeth finally found her voice, shrill and trembling. "Pollock, you killed him? For me? But why? How did you—" "I've been with the family 40 years, my lady. Since before Sir Richard. I knew. I always knew about the ledgers, about Eleanor. I kept quiet, for the family, for you. But when I heard Joanna, heard her plan, heard her say she was coming for you tonight, I just couldn't let her. Or him." She gestured weakly at Wanstead's body. "He was reaching for his own gun when the lights went out. I saw. I had to." The full,
horrifying tapestry of the conspiracy was laid bare. Not just Joanna's vengeance, but the silent, decades-long complicity of the loyal servant, driven to murder to protect the mistress who had profited from the original sin. The pattern Miss Marple had discerned was even more complex and tragic than she had imagined. Vengeance breeding counter-vengeance, lies spawning more lies, each act of violence birthing another in a grotesque cascade. The sound of running feet and shouted commands echoed from the gardens, growing fainter. Joanna was escaping, but the immediate threat in the room was neutralized. Wanstead was dead, killed by the housekeeper's desperate act to protect Lady Elizabeth. Michael was wounded but alive. Mrs. Pollock was broken, confessing. Lady Elizabeth was shattered, the architect of her own downfall exposed. Thorne was a gibbering wreck. Miss Marple straightened up from Michael's side, her gaze sweeping the carnage in the eerie green light. The dinner party had become a slaughterhouse. The twisted plot had claimed another victim, Wanstead, silenced not by Joanna's hand, but by the unforeseen intervention of the quiet housekeeper. Nemesis had struck, but not in the way Joanna had planned. The darkness had concealed not just escape, but a different kind of death entirely. The pattern had emerged, but its final threads were tangled in blood and darkness, leading out into the night with Joanna Farrell, the avenging granddaughter, now a fugitive, her grand design shattered by the very chaos she had unleashed. The darkest hour was upon them, and its end was still shrouded in uncertainty.
Chapter 9. Unmasking Nemesis. The silence that descended upon the blue drawing-room was heavier than the velvet drapes, thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid stench of cordite. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows that turned the opulent space into a grotesque tableau. Professor Wanstead lay sprawled on the Aubusson carpet, his sightless eyes reflecting the greenish glow, a final, neat hole in his forehead, a stark counterpoint to the intellectual rigor he'd displayed in life. Mrs. Pollock slumped in a chair, her plump frame trembling violently, the small pistol now clutched in Davy's steady hand. Lady Elizabeth Verity had collapsed into silent, shuddering tears, her aristocratic composure shattered into a million pieces. Mr. Thorne remained curled on the floor, a small whimpering pool of terror. Michael Farrell leaned against the wall, Miss Marple's blood-soaked handkerchief pressed to his shoulder wound, his face pale with shock and pain, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Joanna had vanished through the window. "Secure the house!" Davies barked, his voice cutting through the shock. Two uniformed officers immediately moved to block the main doors, while others checked the adjoining rooms. "Ambulance and backup are en route. Pollock, you're under arrest for the murder of Professor Wanstead." He recited the caution formally, his face grim. The housekeeper merely nodded, tears streaming silently down her face, her gaze distant, lost in the horrifying reality of what she'd done. Miss Marple knelt beside Michael, her movements economical despite the adrenaline still thrumming through her veins. "Keep pressure, Mr. Farrell," she instructed, her voice calm and steady, a lifeline in the chaos. "The wound appears clean. Help is coming." She gently adjusted the compress, her sharp eyes noting the angle of the entry. "She aimed for the shoulder, Michael, not the heart. Even in her fury, she pulled her shot." Michael flinched, not from pain, but from the words. "She shot me," he whispered, the betrayal raw and bleeding in his voice. "After everything, she shot me." "Love and vengeance are volatile mixtures, young man," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the devastation, the literal blood on the carpet, the figurative blood on every soul present. "How is he?" Davies joined them, his expression tight with concern.
"Stable for now, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "But Joanna is still out there, armed, desperate, and likely heading for the clock tower. It's where she confronted me. It holds significance for her. It's her stage." Davies nodded, his jaw set. "My men are sweeping the grounds. She can't have gotten far. The perimeter is sealed." He turned to the shell-shocked Lady Elizabeth. "My lady, we need to know everything. About Eleanor, about Richard, about the cover-up. Now." Lady Elizabeth drew a shuddering breath, straightening her spine with a flicker of her old dignity, though her hands trembled uncontrollably. "Very well, Inspector," she said, her voice brittle as spun glass. "It is time the truth was known, however damning." She looked at Wanstead's body, then at Mrs. Pollock, a complex mix of horror and something akin to gratitude, flickering in her eyes. "Richard was not an evil man, Inspector, not at first. He loved Eleanor, but he loved the Verity legacy more. When Eleanor discovered the discrepancies in the estate accounts, the funds he'd been diverting for personal investments, she was horrified. She threatened to go to the authorities, to expose him, to bring shame upon the name." She dropped her voice to a whisper. "They argued, horribly. In the library, I heard them. He begged her to reconsider. She refused. She said justice was more important than a name built on lies. The next morning, she was at the foot of the stairs." Lady Elizabeth closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through her powder. "Richard told me it was an accident, that she'd fallen. He was distraught. He said we had to protect the family, the estate, everything. Wanstead, he confirmed it was an accident for a price. Sanders, he handled the rest, the framing of Locke, the suppression of any investigation. He was efficient, ruthless. And I said nothing. I lived with the lie. I benefited from the stolen money. I am as guilty as they were." The confession hung in the air, a heavy shroud of complicity. Mrs. Pollock let out a soft sob. "I knew too, my lady. I saw things. But I served the family. My loyalty was to you." Her gaze drifted to Wanstead's body. "When I heard Joanna tonight, heard her say she was coming for you, and I saw him reaching for his gun in the dark, I just reacted. I couldn't let him harm you." Davies absorbed the information, his face grim. "It's a conspiracy of silence spanning decades, costing multiple lives." He turned his attention back to the immediate crisis. "Miss Marple's right about the clock tower. It's symbolic. Joanna will go there. It's where she believes her vengeance will be complete, or where she'll make her final stand." He looked at Michael. "Can you walk, son? We need you." Michael gritted his teeth, pushing himself upright with Miss Marple's help. "I can manage." "Why me?" "Because Joanna still loves you," Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp with understanding. "However twisted her mind has become, that love is the one fragile thread connecting her to her humanity. It's the only leverage we have." The journey through the darkened, chaotic house was a nightmare. Officers moved with grim efficiency, securing areas, shouting reports into radios. The ambulance crew arrived, swiftly attending to Michael and checking on the others, confirming Wanstead's death. Davies, Miss Marple, and a heavily armed constable made their way towards the rear of the manor, aiming for the kitchen gardens and the path to the clock tower. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Floodlights illuminated the manicured lawns, casting stark shadows. As they approached the dense yew hedge bordering the kitchen gardens, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows near the old stables. It was Joanna.
She stood silhouetted against the lights, the pistol held loosely but purposefully at her side. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her auburn hair escaping its pins, her elegant black dress torn and muddy. She looked less like the composed avenger of the clock tower, and more like a cornered, desperate animal. But her eyes, when they locked onto Michael, burned with a fierce, wounded intensity. "Michael," she called out, her voice raw, cracking with emotion, Are you all right? I didn't mean to hit you. Not really. I had to stop you from stopping me."
Michael swayed slightly, supported by the constable. "You shot me, Joanna. You lied to me. You used me. How could you?" "Because it was necessary," Joanna cried, her voice rising. "Don't you see? They stole everything. My grandmother's life, my grandfather's freedom, my father's name. They lived in luxury, built on murder and lies. And no one cared. No one did anything. I had to make them pay. I had to make the world see what they did." "The world sees now, Joanna," Miss Marple said, stepping forward slightly, placing herself between Joanna and Michael. "Lady Elizabeth has confessed. Wanstead's role is exposed. Sanders and Mrs. Gable are dead because of you. Thorn is broken. Mrs. Pollock will face justice for killing Wanstead. The truth is out. Your vengeance is complete. It's over." Joanna laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Over? It's not over until the last of them faces the consequences. Lady Elizabeth sits there crying, but she's as guilty as Richard. She lived off the blood money. And Thorn, he helped forge the evidence that sent my grandfather to his death. They need to pay. All of them." She raised the pistol slightly, her gaze sweeping past Miss Marple towards the house as if she could see Lady Elizabeth through the walls. "Justice will be served, Joanna," Davy said firmly, moving slowly to one side, trying to angle himself for a clear shot if needed. "Through the courts, not through more murder. Put the gun down. This ends now." "Courts," Joanna spat, her lip curling in contempt. "Courts that Richard and Sanders owned? Courts that let my grandfather die in prison for a crime he didn't commit? No, Inspector. I am the court, and I am the executioner." Her eyes flickered back to Michael, a desperate plea in them. "Michael, please, understand. I did this for us, for our future, a future built on truth, not lies. Stand with me, please." Michael looked at her, his face a canvas of agony, love warring with revulsion, understanding warring with horror. He saw the pain, the righteous fury, the years of festering grief that had twisted her into this. But he also saw the cold-blooded killer who had murdered 2 people and shot him. "I can't, Joanna. I can't stand with this. This isn't justice. It's madness. It's destroying you. It's destroying everything." He took a shaky step forward, away from the constable's support. "I loved the woman you were, but this isn't her. Put the gun down. Come back. Let it end." Joanna's composure finally shattered completely. The pistol wavered. Tears streamed freely down her grimy face. "You don't understand. You can't understand what it's like to grow up with that shadow. To know your grandmother was murdered, your grandfather framed, to feel the weight of that injustice every day. It hollows you out, Michael. It leaves nothing but this." She gestured with the gun, encompassing the darkness, the manor, the bloodshed. "I had to make it right. I had to." "You made it wrong, Joanna," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the despair. "You became the echo of the very evil you fought. You silenced voices, just as Richard silenced Eleanor. You destroyed lives, just as Sanders destroyed Thomas Locke. You sought vengeance, but you only spread more poison. The only way to truly honor your grandparents, to truly break the chain, is to stop, now, before you become the final link in that chain of destruction." Joanna stared at Miss Marple, her breath hitching in sobs. The gun lowered slightly, pointing towards the ground. For a moment it seemed she might crumble, that the weight of Miss Marple's words, the sight of Michael's pale, wounded face, the sheer exhaustion of her long campaign might finally break through the madness. Then a new sound cut through the night,
the sharp, distinctive crack of a rifle shot from the direction of the manor house. It wasn't close, but it was unmistakable. Joanna's head snapped around, her eyes widening in sudden wild panic. She thought they were shooting at her. Instinctively, she raised the pistol again, not towards Michael or Miss Marple, but back towards the house, towards the perceived threat. "No!" Michael yelled, lunging forward, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He wasn't trying to tackle her, he was trying to shield her, to pull her down. Davies and the constable moved simultaneously, shouting commands. "Armed police! Drop the weapon!" But it was too late. Joanna, startled by Michael's lunge and the shouted commands, flinched. Her finger, already tense on the trigger, tightened reflexively. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack. Time seemed to slow. Michael cried out, not from a new wound, but from the force of the bullet passing mere inches from his head, kicking up divots of turf at his feet. Joanna staggered back, the recoil surprising her. Her eyes wide with shock at what she'd nearly done, at how close she had come to killing the man she claimed to love. The distraction was all Davies needed. He closed the distance in 2 swift strides, his own weapon drawn and aimed squarely at Joanna's chest. "Drop it! Now!" he roared, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Joanna looked from Davies's gun to Michael's horrified face to Miss Marple's steady, compassionate gaze. The fight, the fury, the decades of pent-up rage seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind only a profound, hollow exhaustion. Her arm went limp. The pistol slipped from her fingers and fell to the damp grass with a soft thud. She sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands, her body racked with deep, shuddering sobs. "I'm sorry," she wept, the words muffled by her hands and her tears. "Oh God, Michael, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. I just wanted justice." Michael rushed to her side, ignoring his own pain, pulling her into a careful embrace, wincing himself as her weight jostled his shoulder. "It's over, Joanna. It's over," he murmured, his own tears falling freely now. Davies holstered his weapon with a sigh of profound relief, nodding to the constable who moved swiftly to secure the fallen pistol and place Joanna under formal arrest, reading her the rights as she wept brokenly in Michael's arms. Miss Marple watched, a deep sadness settling over her. Nemesis was unmasked, not a goddess of divine retribution, but a broken, grief-stricken woman who had let her righteous fury curdle into monstrous vengeance. She had sought to break the chain of injustice, only to forge new bloody links herself. The twisted plot was unraveled, the pattern of death was exposed, but the cost was etched in blood on the carpets of stony gates and in the shattered lives of those left behind. The darkest hour had passed, leaving behind the harsh, unforgiving light of dawn, and the long, painful road towards a justice that was not vengeance, but something far more difficult and far more human.
Chapter 10. Justice at Last. The grey light of dawn seeped through the tall windows of the Palm Court Hotel's deserted lounge, casting long, weary shadows across the empty armchairs and polished tables. The air, usually redolent of polish and faint perfume, still carried a lingering trace of cordite and fear, a ghostly reminder of the violence that had erupted just hours before at Stonygates. Miss Marple sat alone in a corner, a half-finished piece of knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the square outside, where the first tentative rays of sun touched the wet pavement, turning it to gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape washed clean, but the human landscape remained scarred. The aftermath was a grim tapestry of consequences. Joanna Farrell, the self-styled Nemesis, sat in a stark police interrogation room, her elegant black dress replaced by regulation coveralls, her auburn hair lank. The cold fury that had driven her had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow-eyed husk of grief and dawning horror. Across the table, Inspector Davies and a stern-faced Crown prosecutor laid out the charges: 2 counts of murder, Harold Sanders, Elsbeth Gable;
One count of attempted murder, Michael Ferrell, conspiracy to commit murder, and possession of an illegal firearm. The evidence was overwhelming. Her own confession at the clock tower, the forensic link to the cyanide used on Sanders, the testimony of Michael and Miss Marple, the security footage placing her near the hotel at the time of Mrs. Gable's death, and the pistol recovered from the grass at Stonygates. "They stole everything," Joanna whispered, her voice raw, staring at her manacled hands. "My grandmother's life, my grandfather's freedom, my father's name. All I wanted was for them to see, for the world to know the truth." The righteous fire had guttered, replaced by the chilling realization of the abyss she'd stared into. I became what I hated. Michael Farrell, his shoulder bandaged and his face etched with exhaustion and profound sorrow, sat in a nearby interview room. He'd given his statement, his voice thick with emotion as he described Joanna's confession, her descent into vengeance, and the terrible moment she'd pulled the trigger near him. He spoke of his love for her, now irrevocably tainted by the blood on her hands. He told Davies, "She wasn't the woman I thought she was. Or maybe she was underneath all that pain. But the pain, it consumed her. It made her a monster." He agreed to testify against her, a decision that seemed to tear him apart, even as he knew it was necessary. Lady Elizabeth Verity, the once imperious matriarch, was a broken woman. Confined to her suite under police guard, she'd given a full, tearful confession to Miss Marple and Davies, corroborating Eleanor's letters and detailing Richard Verity's embezzlement, Eleanor's murder, and the subsequent cover-up involving Wanstead, Sanders, and Thorne. She spoke of the suffocating weight of the secret, the guilt that had festered for decades, and her terror when Joanna's vengeance began. "I lived in a gilded cage built on blood and lies," she admitted, her voice frail. "I thought silence was loyalty. It was cowardice." She faced charges of perverting the course of justice and accessory after the fact to murder, though her advanced age and cooperation would likely mitigate her sentence. The Verity legacy, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now synonymous with corruption and tragedy. Mrs. Pollock, the unassuming housekeeper, sat in a cell, her plump face swollen from weeping. She'd confessed without hesitation to killing Professor Wanstead, claiming she'd overheard Joanna's threats against Lady Elizabeth through the servants' door and, in the chaos and darkness, saw Wanstead reaching for a weapon. "I only meant to protect my lady," she sobbed repeatedly. "After all these years, I couldn't let harm come to her." Her loyalty, twisted by decades of complicity, had culminated in violence. She would face murder charges, a tragic footnote in the Verity saga. Mr. Cedric Thorne, the retired solicitor, had suffered a complete breakdown. Sedated in a private hospital ward, he babbled incoherently about forged documents, shadowy figures, and crushing guilt. His professional reputation was in ruins, his life effectively over. Professor Alistair Wanstead's body lay in the county morgue. His death at the hands of Mrs. Pollock was a final brutal irony. The man who had falsified Eleanor Verity's death certificate to protect a murderer had himself been killed to protect the murderer's accomplice. His academic reputation was posthumously destroyed, his name now linked forever to the cover-up. Days bled into a week. The initial shock waves subsided, replaced by the grim, methodical process of the law. Miss Marple, though no longer actively involved in the investigation, remained a central figure. Davies consulted her frequently, valuing her uncanny ability to see the human motivations beneath the legal complexities.
She visited Michael in the hotel, finding him adrift, his world shattered. "You did the right thing, Michael," she told him gently, as he stared blankly out the window, testifying. It wasn't betrayal, it was justice. "Was it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Joanna's in prison for life, Lady Elizabeth disgraced, Wanstead dead, Mrs. Gable dead, Sanders dead. What justice is there in this? Just ruins." "Justice isn't always about restoration, Michael," Miss Marple replied softly. "Sometimes it's simply about truth being known and consequences being faced. Joanna chose the path of vengeance. It led only to more death and destruction. The path you're on now, however, painful, is leading towards accountability, towards ensuring the truth of Eleanor and Thomas Locke is never buried again. That is a form of justice, a painful one, but a necessary one." Michael sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "What do I do now, Miss Marple? How do I live with this?" "You find a way to honor the victims without repeating the sins. You use the knowledge. You build something positive from the ashes. Eleanor wanted the truth exposed. Thomas Locke wanted his name cleared. Their legacy shouldn't only be one of murder and vengeance. It should be one of truth finally prevailing. Perhaps," she suggested, her eyes thoughtful, "you could use your position, your name now, to help others who have been wrongfully convicted, others whose families have been destroyed by secrets and lies."
Michael looked at her, a flicker of something, not hope, perhaps, but purpose igniting in his weary eyes. "The Thomas Locke Foundation," he'd murmured, "for the wrongfully convicted. Using the verity money, the tainted money, to right wrongs, to expose injustice, to give voice to the silenced." The idea took root, a fragile green shoot in the desolate landscape of his grief. Eleanor would have wanted that. Thomas, he would have wanted that. Not vengeance, justice, real justice. Miss Marple nodded, a small approving smile touching her lips. "A worthy legacy, Michael. Far more worthy than the one Richard Verity left behind." The trial, when it came months later, was a media sensation. The Old Bailey courtroom was packed, the public gallery overflowing with journalists and the morbidly curious. Lady Elizabeth Verity, frail and leaning heavily on a cane, testified first, her voice trembling but clear as she recounted the events of 1952, her voice thick with regret as she detailed her own silence and complicity. Her testimony provided the crucial foundation, corroborating Eleanor's letters and exposing the conspiracy at its heart. Michael Farrell followed, his testimony emotionally charged. He spoke of meeting Joanna, their love, her gradual descent into obsession, her confession at the clock tower, and the terrifying confrontation at Stonygates. He described the moment she shot him, the horror of realizing the depth of her madness, and his desperate attempt to reach her. His visible pain and shattered love lent a poignant humanity to the proceedings. Miss Marple was called to the stand. She testified calmly and methodically, recounting her arrival on the tour, her observations of the group dynamics, her discovery of Eleanor's letters hidden in the manor, her encounters with Joanna at the clock tower and the palm court, and her piecing together of the pattern of vengeance. Her clear, logical exposition of the evidence, the cyanide, the tampered balcony railing, the notes, the security footage, provided the forensic backbone to the narrative. She spoke of Joanna's confession, her twisted motives, and the tragic irony of her becoming the echo of the evil she fought. Joanna Farrell herself chose to testify. Dressed somberly, her face pale but composed, she addressed the testifier. Joanna spoke of her grandfather, Thomas Locke, the brilliant artist broken by a wrongful conviction. She spoke of her grandmother, Eleanor Verity, murdered by her own brother for daring to expose his crimes. She spoke of her father, raised in shame and secrecy, haunted by a legacy he never deserved.
Her voice was low, intense, filled with a palpable grief and rage that resonated through the hushed courtroom. "They stole everything," she told the jury, her gaze sweeping over them. "Not just money, not just freedom. They stole history. They stole truth. They stole the right of my grandparents to rest in peace, and the right of my father to know his own heritage. The law failed them. The system failed them. I sought to balance the scales. I sought justice." She paused, her composure cracking slightly. "But I see now. I became the monster I hunted. I added my own atrocities to theirs. For that, I am truly sorry." She didn't plead for mercy, only for understanding of the pain that had driven her. It was a powerful, disturbing performance, but it couldn't absolve her of the calculated murders. The prosecution presented overwhelming forensic evidence, the cyanide residue matching Sanders' death, the analysis of the balcony railing proving deliberate tampering, ballistics reports linking Joanna's pistol to the shots fired at Michael and near Stonygates. They painted a picture of a woman consumed by a decades-old vendetta, meticulously planning and executing a campaign of murder. The defense argued diminished responsibility, citing the profound psychological trauma of her family history. They portrayed her as a victim, driven mad by grief and injustice, not a cold-blooded killer. They highlighted her genuine love for Michael and her moment of hesitation before firing near him. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty. The judge, a stern-faced man known for his intolerance of vigilantism, sentenced Joanna Farrell to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that she serve a minimum of 30 years. As she was led down, her gaze met Michael's in the public gallery. There were no words, only a profound shared sadness, a love irrevocably poisoned by tragedy and blood. Lady Elizabeth Verity received a suspended sentence for her role in the cover-up, given her age, cooperation, and failing health. She retreated to her London townhouse, a virtual recluse, the Verity name forever tarnished. Mrs. Pollock was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, receiving a less sentence. Mr. Thorne remained in psychiatric care. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her familiar armchair in St. Mary Mead. The sun streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The peace of the village was a balm, a stark contrast to the darkness she had navigated. On her lap was a letter, addressed to Mr. Jeremy Raphael, Jason Raphael's son, who had inherited his father's considerable estate and, it seemed, his father's faith in Miss Marple. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, her handwriting neat and precise. "Dear Mr. Raphael, I write to fulfill, as best I can, the final commission your father entrusted me. His letter spoke of an unfinished matter of justice and a nemesis to confront. He was, as ever, perceptive. The matter was indeed unfinished, a festering wound of injustice spanning generations, and Nemesis was indeed unmasked, though not in the form your father might have anticipated. The truth, as it often does, proved both simpler and more terrible than speculation. Lady Eleanor Verity was murdered by her brother, Sir Richard Verity, in 1952, to silence her discovery of his embezzlement from the family estate. This murder was covered up with chilling efficiency. Dr. Alastair Wanstad falsified the death certificate. Harold Sanders, the barrister, not only helped bury the truth, but framed Eleanor's lover, Thomas Locke, for forgery, ensuring his conviction and death in prison. Lady Elizabeth Verity, Sir Richard's wife, knew the truth and remained silent, profiting from the stolen fortune. A junior solicitor, Cedric Thorne, assisted in the fabrication of evidence against Locke. Even the loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Pollock, kept the secret out of misplaced loyalty. This conspiracy of silence poisoned the lives it touched. Eleanor died in prison, an innocent man. Eleanor's unborn child, Joanna Farrell's father, was born in secrecy and shame, his heritage denied. Joanna, discovering this legacy of lies and murder, dedicated her life to vengeance. She became Nemesis, systematically eliminating those she deemed complicit. Sanders, poisoned. Mrs. Gable, the governess who witnessed Eleanor's final argument and kept silent, pushed from her balcony. She planned to kill Wenstad, Thorne, and Lady Elizabeth at Stonygates. Your father's summons placed me in the path of this unfolding tragedy. Through observation, deduction, and the discovery of Eleanor's hidden letters, I uncovered the truth. The confrontation at Stonygates was decisive. Joanna's plan unraveled. In the chaos, Mrs. Pollock, believing she was protecting Lady Elizabeth, shot and killed Professor Wenstad. Joanna was apprehended after a final desperate confrontation where she shot and wounded her own husband, Michael Farrell, who had loved her unknowingly. Justice, in its legal form, has been served. Joanna Farrell was convicted of 2 murders and numerous related charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Lady Elizabeth confessed and faces disgrace, though the law showed her clemency. Mrs. Pollock was convicted of manslaughter. Mr. Thorne remained in psychiatric care.
Yet, from these ruins, something hopeful emerges. Michael Farrell, inheriting the tainted Verity fortune, is establishing the Thomas Locke Foundation. Its purpose? To fight for the wrongfully convicted, to expose injustice, to give voice to the silenced. It is a legacy built not on vengeance, but on the hard-won truth Eleanor Verity died to reveal. It is a testament to the fact that even from the deepest darkness, light can be coaxed, however faintly. I believe your father would have approved. He understood that true justice isn't merely punishment, it's the restoration of truth, the prevention of future wrongs. He trusted me to uncover the twisted plot, and I have. He trusted me to confront Nemesis, and I did, revealing her not as a divine force, but as a deeply wounded human being consumed by grief and rage, becoming the very evil she fought. The darkest hour has passed. The shadows remain, but the light of truth, however painful, now shines. I have fulfilled my promise to your father. I hope this account brings you, as it brought me, a measure of sorrow for the lives destroyed, but also a grim satisfaction that justice, however imperfectly, has been done. With sincere regards, Jane Marple. She signed her name with a flourish, blotted the ink carefully, and folded the letter. Placing it in an envelope, she addressed it. As she reached for a stamp, her gaze fell upon her knitting basket. The half-finished sock lay there, a small, tangible piece of normalcy amidst the chaos she had navigated. She picked up her needles, the cool wood familiar and comforting in her hands. The rhythmic click-clack of the needles filled the quiet room, a soothing counterpoint to the complex tapestry of justice and tragedy she had just documented. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden. A blackbird sang its evening song. St. Mary Mead slept peacefully, unaware of the darkness that had been confronted, the secrets unearthed, the vengeance unmasked. Miss Jane Marple, knitter of socks and solver of dark puzzles, had once again proven that even the deepest shadows could not withstand the persistent, quiet light of truth. The end.